Today's Thursday, May 11th. We're here for the Boulder City Council study session. I'll restate the date because now we're being recorded. Today's Thursday, May 11th, 2023. Good evening. Welcome to our study session of the Boulder City Council. I'm Councilmember Rachel Friend. We'll be leading the study session, and I thank you for joining us. Tonight we have two items, financial update for the City of Boulder and potential ballot measures. It looks like we have no announcements, but somebody please flag me if I have that wrong. So we'll get right to it. And just a reminder to colleagues, for each item, please hold your questions until the end of the presentations. So like for the CU presentation, we can ask questions at the end of theirs. And with that, I will turn it over to our city manager, Nuria Rivera-Vandermeide, to take us into the financial update.
Thank you so much, council member. And we have a very full, mostly finance focused agenda today with some ballot issues intermixed. So I'm going to stop talking and go straight to the people that know it best and have the expertise. And I will send it over to Kara.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Council. Kara Skinner, Chief Financial Officer. Pleased to be here tonight for the financial update and budget outlook as Mark is bringing up the presentation here. We do this every spring, and we're happy to go over this with you all tonight. You can go to the next slide. So this is our agenda for tonight, and first we're going to start off with our partners from CU. We've been partnering with Brian, Rich, and Robert for 3 years now, and we've really appreciated their advice, good analytics, and then their modeling for our sales tax. So we'll look forward to their presentation. At the end of their presentation, we'll do a quick question and answer so that you can ask Brian, and Robert is also here tonight, questions if you have them. And then we will shift over to the staff presentation for items 2 through 4 on our agenda. So with that, I'm going to invite Brian Lewandowski to kick us off.
All right.
I believe there he is.
Yeah,
hi,
thanks
Brian.
so much, Cara. How are
Welcome.
you? All right, so thanks everyone for the opportunity to speak with you tonight. I am Brian Lewandowski, and I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Robert McNown, who's our expert econometrician. Rich Wabakin couldn't be here tonight because, as you're probably aware, we have commencement, and the business school has our ceremony this evening, so he's engaged in those activities. So I'm going to provide a very brief update about the current economic conditions, and then we'll talk a little bit about the local sales and use tax forecast that we generate. So please advance the slide. So kick this off. I'd like to take a look at a snapshot of economic indicators nationally that are a sort of barometer of the overall economy. And really not coincidentally, these are many of the same metrics that the National Bureau of Economic Research looks at when identifying turning points within the economy. So you may recall a year ago when we were talking about the 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth that the US measured. And many people were saying, well, aren't we in a recession right now? And when I pulled up this very same slide, these indicators were all moving in a growth position. Most of these indicators were green, with a couple of red ones on the screen, especially in terms of GDP. And now we're in this period where we have growing GDP, but many of the indicators are actually signaling a slowdown. And so this is what I'm going to talk about for a few minutes. One exception there, of course, is employment. So next slide, please. So the US GDP, you can see the profound impact that the pandemic had on the economy. You can see that wedge that was taken out of gross domestic product. And remember that gross domestic product is really one of the broadest measures of economic activity within our economy. It measures the sale of goods and services within the economy. And we look at real GDP because it removes inflation. So it's really trying to measure if we're selling a greater quantity of goods and services. And if your eyes follow those red dots that are on the screen, it's somewhat subtle, but you can see those 2 negative quarters of GDP growth that were then followed by pretty strong growth in the second half of 2022. And that second half of the year really eclipsed what happened in the first half, and we ended up having about 2.1% GDP growth for the year, which is sort of interesting to look at over the last 23 years. It's a little bit above average. First quarter data was released about 2 weeks ago, and it was somewhat of a disappointment. We grew 1.1% at an annualized rate. It came in below expectations. But again, the details are what are important. And when I take a look at consumption, consumption grew about 3.7%. That's a really solid number. We saw growth in government spending. We saw net exports actually improve. So both exports and imports grew, but exports actually grew a little bit faster. And then the real headwind came in terms of investment. And we recorded the 8th consecutive quarter of negative fixed investment in residential. Not a big surprise in the current housing situation that we're in with higher interest rates. And we also saw a turn in inventories. Those were really the two most negative components in this GDP report. Nonetheless, the year is expected to sort of progress at a soft pace. And by the end of the year, we think it'll be pretty slow growth. The consensus is for just over 1% growth for the full year. And there's a lot of narrative right now about whether we'll be in a recession by the end of the year or not. And so we're watching the consumption piece especially closely. Mark, if you can please advance the slide one. And I think my own sort of personal belief is that so much of this rests on what happens with consumption. So we know that consumption is about 70% of economic growth in the country. We just had a good first quarter, but we also know that there's a lot of headwinds that consumers are facing right now. If it's negative real wage growth, if it's depleted savings, we see a decrease in the savings rate in general at a lower pace compared to the historical average. We see consumers taking on more debt and paying higher interest on that debt. And so there's sort of this question of how long can the consumer sustain consumption? How long can that be wind in the economic sails of the U.S. With all of these factors at play? And I think one wild card there is this pace of hiring that we've observed nationally. You can see, again, the recession, the bite that it took out of jobs in this country, and then the rebound. We're up over 3 million jobs from the pre-recession peak, 2.2% above where we were. And this year we've added jobs at a pace of about 285,000 per month for the first 4 months of the year. And we added about 250,000 jobs in the month of April alone. So think about an average wage nationally of 67,000 per job times 250,000 jobs, and that's just billions and billions of additional potential consumption within the economy. So in my mind, so much of the pace of growth over the next 8 months will depend on the pace of hiring. And so in my mind, this is what sort of keeps us between a slow growth environment or a soft recession environment. Next slide, please. And so there's sort of this confounding effect right now in the economy where we have all of this job growth. We have continued a high rate of job openings. And a really low rate of unemployment. And when we take a look at that ratio nationally of the number of job openings per every person who's unemployed, that ratio is 1.6 to 1. So 1.6 job openings for every unemployed person, which oversimplifies it because we know matching people to jobs at wage rates and locations is very complex. But that illustrates the job shortage. And when we take a look at Colorado, it's even a little bit more pronounced. It's 2.4 job openings for every unemployed person. And Colorado is one of only 9 states that recorded an increase in job openings last month, most states recorded a decrease in job openings. And then we think about the multi-job holders nationally, and that number went down over the last couple of months, which even makes this worker shortage problem more pronounced. It extends it. It's not helping us close the gap. Next slide, please. Another point of good news, along with hiring, we're also seeing an improvement in inflation. So it's pretty clear that the rate of inflation peaked last summer, and across a broad swath of geographies nationally, we're seeing a consistent downward trend in prices. And so up here you can see the mountain states, you can see the US, and you can also see the Denver metro region. And we just got new national data yesterday, and the national inflation rate fell for the 10th consecutive month. So increasing at a decreasing pace, 4.9% nationally for the top line number. The Denver metro region, we only get every other month. So back in March, or just 1 month ago, the Denver metro region was at 5.7%. So this downward pressure on prices is certainly helping. What's interesting is when we take a look a little bit upstream in that whole supply chain, the producer price index has come down even more. So the final demand PPI was just released this morning, and it was down to 2.4% year over year, also the 10th consecutive month of slowing price growth in products. And the other thing I would note here is the construction component of PPI, which excludes the labor piece, was negative year over year for the last couple of months. Next slide, please. For those of you who have heard me speak before, you probably know that I'm a big fan of benchmarking. I like to benchmark Colorado against itself over time, and also against all the other states nationally. And so here's what you're seeing is Colorado's rank among the 50 states. So in some of these metrics, you can see we're still ranking pretty highly in terms of real GDP growth. We were 8th year over year in the 4th quarter of 2022. But for employment growth, this is sort of a shocking number. We slowed to 49th best in the country, 2nd worst. We're just ahead of West Virginia in terms of job growth. And I'll talk a little bit more about this number in a moment, but this is a story that I have really never told in my time here at the University of Colorado, that we've been a bottom 10 state in terms of job growth. Personal income, we still rank really high in terms of personal income growth. We're still ranking really high. Labor force participation, we actually have the 4th highest labor force participation rate in the country. So it's certainly not all bad news, but I think the employment piece locally is something for us to watch. Next slide, please. And so this is just giving you a little bit more detail on the employment situation. So on the left, the black line is showing you Colorado statewide job growth, total number of jobs. And our state labor office is just an invaluable service to us. Most states don't do this, but our state office publishes what they call expected revisions to employment. And they came out with a report about 3 weeks ago that said, we think that employment has been a little bit undercounted by about 17,000 jobs per month over the last few months. So that's good news. It certainly improves this narrative. But when I add the 17,000 jobs, that moves us from being 49th in the country to 39th in the country. So it doesn't put us back in the top 10 or top 20. It just makes it a little less bad than what we're looking at right now. They also provide revisions to Boulder counties or the Boulder metropolitan statistical area. And unfortunately, the Boulder MSA didn't really get a bump from those revisions. In fact, they estimate that Boulder maybe was overestimated a little bit by about 700 jobs or so. The pace of growth in Boulder County is still outpacing the state when it comes to year-over-year growth. Next slide, please. So this is digging in a little bit more into the details for Boulder County's employment. And this is the most granular data that's reported at a local level on a monthly basis. So that's why I'm looking at Boulder County and not the city of Boulder. But you can see the largest industries like professional and business services. This includes our high-tech industries, software development, research and development, architecture, design work. And this tends to be a high-skill, high-pay industry in the state. Colorado has a comparative advantage in these businesses, in these jobs, and so does Boulder. But you can see it looks like we're missing a bar in the jobs added year over year and in the percent change. And it's just that this number was flat. So I think this is something for us to keep an eye on. It's a little bit of a concern to see this flattening. If you scroll down, you can see the information sector, third from the bottom. This also includes a lot of our high-tech companies. Some of these are companies that have made headline news for some job losses nationally. We've seen a little bit of a pullback in Boulder. And then financial activities is a sector that's certainly at the forefront of a few crises, including interest rate increases and decreasing deposits. This is a sector where we've seen some job losses as of late. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to move on to the topic at hand. It's really taking a look at sales and use taxes. So I'm going to provide a little bit of a narrative about what we're seeing nationally and relate that to the local economy. So what we have plotted here is national retail sales, and then we have Colorado sales taxes plotted in the gold bar. And I put these two together to really illustrate how these two move in tandem. So the peaks and the troughs, the turns in this series really follow each other. So Colorado is not decoupled from what happens nationally. But you can also pick up subtly there that Colorado has been sort of outpacing the nation in terms of growth. So we get information about the national retail sales pretty timely, where we can take a look at March data right now. And so that's a good leading indicator for us to watch as far as what to expect. And nationally, retail sales grew 2.9%. Colorado, by the last measure, was up a little over 6%. Remember, 2.9% is below the rate of inflation. So that's really talking about negative real retail sales growth. And on a month-over-month basis, we've seen a decline in about 3 of the last 4 months or so. When we take a look at the details, we're seeing softer growth or even negative growth in some of our goods producing sectors where services continue to outperform. Next slide. And so I like to benchmark again communities around Colorado. And one way of doing this, because every local community has a different tax base, different goods that they're taxing. Maybe some tax groceries and others don't, or some software and others don't. So we can take a look at the state's collection of sales taxes across all of the jurisdictions. And so that provides a nice apples to apples comparison across all of Colorado cities and counties. And so what I've pulled here is the 30 largest city collections that the state has grabbed in 2022. And then I pulled data in early 2023. I think this is actually showing January and February now. That's mislabeled at the top. And so what we see here is the state overall average was up 5.8% for the first 2 months of the year over year. And then you can see Boulder came in just a little bit below that average. And then some of the faster growth was in Commerce City, Thornton, and Vail. And then Wheat Ridge was a community that actually recorded a decline year over year. Next slide, please. So we take so much of this data into consideration when creating the Boulder sales tax revenue model. Really what we're doing here is taking a lot of national data, and we look at how Boulder's economy and the Colorado economy perform in relation to those national variables. And we have a forecast from Moody's Analytics that provides a baseline expectation for where we expect the economy to go. And then we model out what that means for the city of Boulder in terms of sales and use taxes. Next slide, please. And we've really transitioned to a model where we disaggregate Boulder's sales and use taxes. So there's about 9 or so individual revenue streams that we look at, and we model those out individually, and then we sum them up to come up with the sales tax forecast and the use tax forecast. And then we look at the confidence bounds. So we take a look at the high forecast and the low forecast around that medium expectation. And then we actually run two different economic scenarios that Moody's provides. One that's a little bit more optimistic, that says the economy will perform a little bit better under the scenario, and one that's a little bit more pessimistic. So we provide city staff with a wide range of expectations. And we provide an annual forecast out through 2028. And we also provide a quarterly forecast out through that horizon. So we see a lot of detail. In the quarterly one, we measure a lot of seasonality because of just when sales occur within the city of Boulder. Okay, next slide, please. And I'm almost done here. So, you know, when we're thinking about the economic forecast and choosing what we think is the most likely pathway for the economy, we think about what could possibly be the wind in our sails, what's the tailwind for the national economy and the local economy, and then what's really providing concerning headwinds. And I'll tell you, over the last 6 months, the red bubble here has filled up. It used to be a little bit more balanced, but I think it's really reflecting that there are more concerns that we're watching right now than there are tailwinds. And I'm going to just talk about three briefly. I think one major headwind is financial, and there's subcomponents to this where I think that the debt ceiling debate that's happening right now is really concerning. And I can't even say exactly what will happen if we pass that deadline, because we haven't really been in this situation before to any real degree. You know, what happens with our credit rating if that happens? What happens with interest rates? What happens with retirement if we actually reach that debt ceiling? But also in the financial category is what's going on with banks right now. We've seen a handful of banks fail. And we've seen over $1 trillion get sucked out of banks in the term with regards to deposits. So $1 trillion outflow. So even if those banks aren't domiciled in Colorado, we've surely seen an outflow of deposits. And that has implications for banks and having to raise funds at potentially a higher cost, and also has implications for financial conditions for businesses and individuals, if they can even access that capital or not. The second concern I would point out is labor. We're still seeing just incredible demand for workers. But I think if hiring slows down, I think that spells trouble in the short term. There's tension in Colorado in that we have a high labor force participation rate, labor force growth. We have a really high number of job openings, but we're measuring really slow employment growth. So I think there's a little bit of tension there within the reported numbers. And then the third concern that I would close with is remote work. And I bring this up because of the impact that remote work has had on central business districts, especially when we think about places like downtown Denver and to some degree, Boulder. If we see higher office vacancy rates, we then think about that multiplier effect. If people aren't in the community, working in the community, they're not spending money in the community, they're not going out to lunch, they're not shopping at the mall. So it not only has financial implications, but it has impacts on the vibrancy of a community, and also could impact commercial real estate defaults as we look ahead over the next couple of years. Okay, now my closing slide. So I just want to thank all of you for your time. I think I was a little bit long-winded, so I apologize. But lastly, I would really be remiss if I didn't thank Cara Skinner and Mark Wolf and Joel Wagner for all of their help through these forecasting exercises, because we ask for a lot from them. We ask for a lot of detail so that we can produce better and better forecasts. So it's a true partnership, and we couldn't do it without you. So thank you.
Thanks. Cara, do you have anything else, or can I? open it up for questions?
No, I think you can
All right.
open it up.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that always illuminating presentation. And thank you also to Robert for being here. Who has questions? Mark Wallach, you were going to disappoint me if you did not have a question. You're up.
You know, in the larger cities, there's a real crisis with respect to vacancy rates on large office towers and commercial real estate generally. Do we have anything analogous going on in the city of Boulder? What kind of vacancy rates are we looking at here?
I don't actually have that number, but I have access to it. So Mark, I can get that over to Cara, and she can share that back with you. We have access to some Newmark data and some CoStar data.
Okay. My only other question was in the taxable sales growth, it seems that a number of the highest performers are ski resort towns. Is that the norm?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think a lot of this has to do with timing. So we saw some communities bounce back sooner from the pandemic recession. And so I think if we plotted all of these out, you would see some early risers, and then they just plateaued a little bit earlier. We have seen the mountain resort communities outperform over the last few months. So I wouldn't say that is always a truism, but it's just true over the short-term period right now.
So should we regard that as sort of skewing the result a little bit in terms of our own performance?
Well, I've got the data for last year. While we're chatting here, I'll pull it up. I think that if I recall correctly, Boulder hasn't led the pack, hasn't led the top 30, but it also hasn't lagged the top 30. I think Boulder has sort of sat in that middle 50% over the last couple of years. So I don't look at that as a concerning metric. I think it's good to sort of be aware of how your peers are doing within the community.
Okay. All right, thank you. Assuming that's not disappointing to my colleague Rachel, that's the end of my questions.
Great job. Next up, Matt Benjamin.
Thanks, Rachel, and appreciate the presentation and the year in, year out work that you guys provide to give us this forecast. I'll just start with, I think based on Mark's logic of comparing us to resorts, that I think he's suggesting we open up the Flatirons to be a new ski resort. So I'll hold him to that. No, more seriously, one of the things that Brian, you mentioned a lot is really referencing the COVID, trench. And so I'm wondering, to what extent have you and your models, or have economists in general, really fundamentally maybe changed assumptions based on what COVID has actually changed in society in terms of consumer behavior, just everything that COVID is, versus thinking of it as a transient thing like, oh, this recession occurred and we're right back to business as usual. Can we really be back? Can we really keep those business as usual assumptions going forward? So I'm really just sort of curious where your thoughts are and how that may or may not, modify what we look forward to in terms of forecasting.
Yeah, super interesting question. Robert, I'm going to call on you to describe the modeling effort and how we treated the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks. I'll mention a couple of things in response to your question, Matt. One thing that we did in reaction to the onset of the pandemic right away was to realize that we had all these components for sales tax revenues that were moving in different directions. And whereas previously we had simply had an aggregate forecast of total sales tax revenues in a single equation for that, we broke down into these various categories. And so that way we've adapted the model to accommodate the unusual situation we faced both going into the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic. And I think still, when you look at the headwinds and tailwinds that Brian described, that those changes, which are difficult to anticipate, are going to have different impacts on these different components as well. So I think that's the best thing that we can do to adapt to that situation. Let's see, was that the full part of your question, Matt, or was there something else too?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was just, I mean, I think you kind of addressed it, but just kind of just knowing that the pandemic is going to have more of a permanence rather than it being transient. And I'm just sort of wondering if that's kind of what is accepted, or is there still this conflict between that might be the case versus we're just going to kind of go back to 2019 and that's where the world will end up. So I'm just wondering, you and your industry, is there sort of a consensus one way or the other?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure about other forecasters, but we're definitely we're not moving our model back to pre-2020 by any means. I mean, we're going to maintain the breakdown of the categories, and sometimes we explore different ones as well. So some of the unusual headwinds that we're facing right now, some of the financial conditions, the tightening of monetary policy, the inflation itself is to some extent an aftermath of the pandemic too. And so the model really needs to adapt to all of those changes, and we try to stay on top of that as best we can.
Is that all your questions, Matt?
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it, Robert. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah.
Nicole Spear, you're up.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian, for the presentation. I just had a couple of questions. If I was looking at that inflation rates chart correctly, it looked like our transportation rates were way higher than everybody else's. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit and what's going on there.
Yeah, that's a really astute observation there. So there's two components to this. And Mark, I don't know if it's easy to pull that back up and put it on slide 6, but there are about 10 categories of inflation and 10 buckets of spending, and transportation is one of them. It's part of, thank you, one more, right there. Okay, so there's the all items, which is top line inflation. And then if you look all the way at the bottom, there's a separate category there that's called core inflation. That's all items less food and energy. Because food and energy are really price volatile within the economy, right? Like we observe gasoline prices just have these wild swings. So they look at core inflation to sort of remove that noise that's within prices, even though we're really paying for those goods from our disposable personal income. Okay, so then if you look up at the difference between Colorado and the US for transportation, last month, the US was actually negative for transportation, while Colorado was up 4%. And we attribute a lot of that to the spike in gasoline prices that we had locally, which we attribute back to the Suncor refinery shutdown. And now we're really seeing gasoline prices come down in Colorado. There's some areas that are sub $3 per gallon now. So I think, you know, if you take a look at core inflation for Denver versus the nation, we're about the same. Last month, we were exactly the same. So I think that delta that we see on top line inflation really has to do largely with transportation and the higher energy costs that we've been paying locally, which is not great news, but we are seeing it come down at a pretty fast pace. So I would expect Colorado to be more aligned with national inflation over the next few months.
Thank you. And just kind of a follow-up, I mean, do you think this is having an impact, like as these costs become a little bit reduced in the coming months? Do you think that will have an impact on spending? Because I can imagine, especially here where a lot of people commute in, you know, if you're spending that much more on transportation, you know, is that impacting what you have for other items?
Yeah, absolutely. So that comes out of our disposable personal income. And I remember last summer when gasoline prices actually topped $5 a gallon, and then they fell really quickly in Colorado, and they got down to below $3 a gallon. So think about that as a $2 savings per gallon. And if you're putting 20 gallons in your car a week, that's a pretty big savings. And we end up spending that somewhere else. So so as prices come down, that does help support other consumption.
Thank you. And just one other question. So we've got some groups in Boulder County, and our Councilmember Lauren Folkerts has been working on this a little bit, who are starting to talk about a minimum wage increase. And I'm just wondering, would any of your projections for next year change at all if there were to be kind of a minimum wage increase starting? Do you expect that would affect any of the sales tax revenue or worker shortages that you've seen?
So I'll answer part of it, and then I'll have Robert chime in and think about it from a modeling perspective. I'm not sure what you're thinking about for a minimum wage, but when I talk to businesses around the broader Denver metro region, I haven't found anyone that's really paying a true minimum wage. There's sort of this natural minimum wage that's above the legal minimum wage. So I wonder if we were already capturing the wage increases within the model currently. So I'm not sure how much a delta, a small delta, would really show up.
Cool. Thank you.
Is that it, Nicole? Any other questions for Brian and Robert? Lauren Folkerts, was that an accident? Your hand went up and then down, and you are on mute.
Sorry. I appreciate the direction Nicole was going with that. As we think about a minimum wage effort going forward, is that something you guys could help us think about in terms of impacts that it might have on jobs or the economy, especially because the state law is pretty particular. You can't increase more than 15% per year. So it's likely that a plan might involve increases over a longer period of time rather than just a one-time increase. Mm-hmm. So kind of trying to game out what that might look like for our economy and our sales tax.
Yeah, I think that would be an interesting challenge to try to understand better what sort of an external force on wages would produce in terms of employment, labor force participation, and so on. So it's I think it's within the scope of our expertise. It's certainly not directly a part of the model at this point, but we could adjust to analyze a situation like that.
Thank you.
Well, that's great to hear. So we will maybe be in touch with you on that. And I was just feeling sad personally. This is, my last financial update that on my term on council, and it has been a pleasure and super helpful to have your involvement the last 4 years. Like COVID was bumpy time. So we really are, you helped the city out a lot, and thank you for being here again tonight.
Thank you.
If there are no other questions for the two of you, I think you're free to go. Okay. Although around if you like.
Thank you.
And congrats to your graduates.
Yeah, we appreciate your cooperation too.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Cara, back to you.
Thank you. And thanks again to Robert and Brian. We appreciate it. I am going to quickly just turn this over. The next portion of the presentation is the staff, and it will be the budget team. And I'm happy to introduce both Charlotte Husky, a principal analyst on the budget team, and then Mark Wolf will follow her. And I'll give a short intro so that we can just keep it going. So with that, I'll hand it over to Charlotte.
Thanks, Cara. Good evening, Council. I'm Charlotte Husky, a Principal Budget Analyst with the Budget Office. Happy to be here tonight to discuss the 2024 budget preview and financial update. So looking at our major revenue sources for the City of Boulder, the sales and use tax collections for 2022 came in at $13.5 million above the original budget. This includes $6.7 million within the general fund. When we compare this to 2021 collections, this is an 11.6% year-over-year increase, or 14.1 million over our 2021 collections. And the increased revenues stemmed from certain tax categories, primarily due to the inflationary impacts of the cost of goods. The only areas where we saw declines were in the marijuana and consumer electrics categories for our sales tax categories. We did shift our revenue budget in mid-year in 2022 when building the 2023 budget, and that resulted in a slight gap in revenue collections of 1.1 million below our 2022 revised projections. So we came in 1.1 million in actuals below our 2022 mid-year revised projections across all funds that receive sales and use tax revenues, and specifically in the general fund that was a shortage of 550,000. For our use tax collections for 2022, they came in 3.9 million above the original budget in 2022, and 1.9 million of this was within the general fund. Across our use taxes, when we compare 2022 to 2021 actuals, business use and motor vehicle use were down slightly, with construction use tax increasing year over year by 3.6 million. When we look at our previous performance of receiving higher sales and use tax collection against our budgeted model, we actually shifted our approach in looking at the 2023 budget and used a less conservative forecast in our model. With this change of shifting and using a less conservative forecast, we forecasted higher revenues, and we programmed these additional anticipated revenues in 2022 and in 2023 toward council and community priorities in the budget. And overall, we budgeted using a forecasted model that anticipates less flexibility in sales and use tax in 2023 and 2024. The 2023 budget included an assumption of an economic slowdown in 2023, as well as a slowdown in inflationary pressures, which would positively impact our sales tax collections. We saw, looking at our February 2023 collections, a negative year-over-year growth in several sales and use tax categories, and we'll continue to work with CU, who will produce a new model for us in June, which will help inform our final guidance for 2024. Slide. So looking at our property tax, which is another major revenue source for the city of Boulder, we'll talk about potential property tax relief questions on the November ballot at our next agenda item after a financial update, but just wanted to focus on the pie chart here, where the total mill levy in Boulder comprises a combination of taxing entities within Boulder, including the highest being the school district at 55% of the total mill levy, 27% of that being attributed to the county, and the city portion just at 13% of this pie. Homeowners will see an impact and feel the impact of the total property tax bill with the additional county and library district mill levies, as well as the assessed value increases that have come out recently. Our staff has performed initial analysis on the preliminary assessed value increase for the city of Boulder, and we're seeing an estimated 32% increase compared to the 2022 property tax year. And we'll continue to monitor impacts of the state legislation and items that will be on the November ballot. And this generates uncertainty around our property tax revenues for 2024, where we could see an increase in our revenues from property tax if there's no voter action taken in November. However, we could see a decrease from our current assumptions if certain propositions receive enough votes this November. Next slide. So looking at our general fund from 2022 actuals seen on this table, our revenues came in above adopted budget and our expenses fell below our anticipated expenditures in the 2022 budget. And therefore, we contributed 12.9 million to fund balance in 2022. Looking at our early projections for the 2023 revised budget, we anticipate ending the year with between 10 and 15 million in fund balance after reserves. And this presents us with an opportunity to address one-time funding needs, such as capital infrastructure needs. And with this in mind, our recommendation will be to transfer a significant portion of this ending fund balance to the governmental capital fund to support continued development of Alpine Balsam and the Western City campus site. It's also ideal to continue to leave some ending fund balance for flexibility within the general fund as well. And we'll also be bringing forward some recommendations within our ATB1 requests next week, as well as considerations of one-time uses in the 2024 budget. So you all are very familiar with this slide. This is our 3-year plan for budgeting for resilience and racial equity. We are currently in year 2 of our plan, where we're beginning to gather data relative to racial equity and working with departments to determine the benefit and burden relative to outcomes within their department program areas. And year 3, we hope to begin to utilize this data to support more strategic decision-making around the budget process and to evaluate the investment of our impact and investments within our budget on racial equity outcomes. Next slide. Key in this plan for budgeting for resilience and equity is community engagement. So we have structured 2 windows in our 2024 development of the budget for community engagement. The first being in March and April, where we worked directly with community connectors and residents to receive feedback on our investments made in 2023, understand potential gaps and areas to address in the 2024 budget. We shared these themes with department directors in early May with the hope to inform budget development going into 2024. Our second window we will plan to perform this August, where we'll perform a broader community feedback survey, where we will solicit broader community input, and we'll also circle back with community connectors and consult with budget themes and key investments that we're seeing bringing forward in the 2024 recommended budget. The second window of the community engagement plan will end at the end of August, and we'll plan to share feedback with council at the September 14th study session. As a recap of our 2023 funding and budgeting decisions, the focus of the 2023 budget development was to finalize restorations and address critical community issues. This included shifting our budget philosophy to include maximizing the use of available resources to address ongoing funding needs. This included shifting, as mentioned before, to a less conservative approach in our sales and use tax model, as well as shifting how we budget for personnel, where we're accounting for typical vacancy savings across the organization. This shift in philosophy enabled our investments in 2023 to reflect our unique budgeting environment, including an increase in FTEs across all funds of 57 FTEs from the 2022 budget, as well as adding 53 million above the 2022 adopted budget. Several investments were made with one-time dollars. So one of the things to think about in moving forward to the 2024 budget is the investments made with one-time dollars, yet implications of future ongoing costs. Looking at our budget and spending trends since 2020 across all of these areas seen in the table here, including our citywide FTE count and our citywide budget, the 2023 adopted budget reflects an increase reaching above our pre-pandemic levels now. And the 2020 adopted budget, which was developed in 2019, these numbers reflect the last budget developed prior to pandemic implications. And seen here in the middle column, the 2021 budget demonstrates cuts compared to our 2020 adopted budget due to the pandemic. And in this third column, you can see our 2023 adopted budget, where we've increased 22 million in general fund, in the general fund ongoing line item above our 2020 pre-pandemic budget. And we're also currently working towards reintegrating and staffing up an additional 170 FTEs that we've added to the organization. Considering all of the trends that we're seeing and the shift in philosophy, moving into our 2024 budget development, there are budget constraints and as well as opportunities to consider. As mentioned previously, within the 2023 revised general fund budget, we're anticipating fund balance after reserves, which provides opportunities to address one-time capital needs. There are several major constraints to consider approaching the 2024 budget that limit additional ongoing funding, including this list here, such as the impact of the 0.15 expiration of our sales tax, which generates approximately 7.5 million annually in general fund revenue supporting personnel and programs across the city. Also considering the timing of the library separation and repayment for library services provided in 2023, and recent commitments to ongoing funding for one-time funded items in the 2023 budget or piloted items. We're also considering the increase in personnel costs, thinking of ongoing union negotiations, and then additional upcoming infrastructure needs, such as the Western City Campus project. Considering these items, including the library reallocation, future of our 0.15 sales tax, and property tax revenues, this provides us with a strategic opportunity to think about our investments for 2024 and moving forward for the 2024 budget development. And with that, I will hand it off to Mark.
Thank you, Charlotte. Good evening, Council. Mark Wolf, Budget Officer. I will take you through our 6 key budget assumptions for the 2024 budget development. Each of these raise some focus areas in terms of funding and policy that will be addressed during the budget process. This will give you an opportunity to hear insight into how we are approaching the 24 budget, and also an opportunity to provide some feedback. I'll be walking through each of these 6, and then I'll be joined by Parks and Recreation here soon, as they'll talk a little bit more detail about their fee policy. So starting with number 1, slowing economic growth and known funding requirements significantly limit budget flexibility for ongoing costs. So that speaks a lot to all the information that you've heard over the past hour. A couple of specifics in terms of the commitments that Charlotte mentioned that we have made in 2023. Day Services Center, we budgeted in 2023 with one-time dollars. We now have an estimate of 1.2 for operating costs for that center and 10 million for capital. So we'll need 1.2 million of new ongoing dollars for 2024. For the behavioral health or care program, we programmed that with one-time dollars in 23. We have an estimate of 1.3 million for 2024. Given some of the constraints in hiring for that program, we did have to go ahead and make that an ongoing commitment permanent staff this year. So we will need to program that amount for 24. For safe and managed public spaces, the total program cost is 3.2 million. 2.3 of that is already programmed within the budget ongoing. We have 850,000 funded as one time to continue that pilot in 23 for the Downtown Ambassador program and the Urban Parks Rangers. So if those two aspects of the program were to be permanent, that would be an additional 900,000. And then there's several other various commitments that we've made since budget adoption last fall, again, about 900,000. So that brings us to a total of new ongoing budget needed in the general fund of 4.3 million. And we'll just point out that our current estimate, without considering the library dollars, is only 3 to 4 million available for ongoing funding. So that's a conundrum that we'll talk about how to approach in a moment. Really, it comes down to our first opportunity looking at library budget reallocation funds and the approach to address some of the key council priorities. Stepping back, I won't go too far into detail on the facilities master plan and Western City Campus. You're going to get a deep dive into that in 2 weeks. What the FMP does, though, is it provides a blueprint for us to address the rising costs of our maintenance needs across our facilities and ways to approach our long-term facilities planning. The Western City Campus is a big part of that in a lot of ways, one of the big dominoes in how we approach a number of our projects. The financing model will talk about some of the key levers that you all will be weighing in on, and especially consolidation of buildings, sale and profiting from the sale of buildings in order to help with the financing, the type of financing, and how we approach our operational savings from that consolidation. We will need additional ongoing funding to support that project that will impact the 2025 budget, either in the form of debt service or a partnership funding. And you all will get more detail about that at your next meeting. Well, 2 meetings. So again, just to show the first two, day services and behavioral health, the suggestion here is that we're making the assumption for the 24 budget development that we'll need to tap into the library reallocation dollars to fund the day services center and the care program, which are great opportunities there. And then also do a placeholder. We do have some potential debt service programmed already in our governmental capital fund, but this would supplement that an additional 2.5, again, knowing that this is likely to come in some format in 2025. The third is related to capital. So the capital improvement program will include long-range facilities planning to ensure sustainable funding strategies for building maintenance and associated services. The 6-year CIP or capital improvement program will align with our sustainability, equity, and resilience framework, our Boulder comp plan, and sub-community and area plans. One point of emphasis for this year's budget development is the community, culture, resilience, and safety tax dollars. That's our largest source of general capital dollars that we have available. We have done some planning efforts over the last year related to projects that would be eligible under CCRS. We will be bringing forward prioritized projects and financing strategies, including potentially issuing a bond around CCRS that we do have authorization for by voters. That's likely to exceed the overall need. So again, this conversation around facilities master planning and our approach to facilities in the long term will be critical to balance the items that we won't be able to cover under CCRS. And just to hammer that point, we have 3 recreation centers that need to be addressed in some format, 2 fire stations, a public safety building, not to mention the Alpine Balsam project and others. The CCRS tax is $200 million over 15 years. We have the authorization to borrow up to $110 million. So that'll make a significant dent in some of those projects, but we will need a unified approach in terms of how we talk about many of these other portfolio related projects that may not be able to be addressed with CCRS. Flexibility that we do have within the dedicated funds will be explored and emphasized to ease the burden on the general fund to the extent possible, including other revenue strategies such as reviewing fee policies, and the one we'll dive into tonight is Parks and Recreation. We did identify this as an issue during our conversation around library reallocation back in February, and we outlined several action steps. This is really about making sure that we're in alignment with voter intent on any of those restricted revenues, and that we're maximizing the use of those resources. So we've undertaken a couple of these steps already, and this will help inform the 2024 budget as we review those dedicated fund financials, the restrictions, and determine short and long-term financial strategies for these other funds. We think that can be helpful in looking across the entire city in terms of our resources. One of those in particular is related to our Parks and Recreation fees, and I am happy to hand off to Jackson Height, Senior Manager in Parks and Recreation, who will walk through a few slides on Parks and Rec fees.
Thanks so much, Mark. As Mark said, Jackson Height with Business Services and Parks and Recreation. This is the slide that you saw back when the Parks and Recreation plan was adopted last summer. And at that point in time, we had told you that without additional funding, BPR would need to maintain, or would need additional funding to maintain our current level of service to ease the general fund of their financial support. We had identified that this could include grants, philanthropy, and donations, additional tax subsidy, or other revenue generating ideas. Since this time, we've really taken the feedback that was given and identified an opportunity to address this through a fee policy. We are hoping to implement a fee policy in 2024. On the next slide, we've identified that there's almost 3,200 fees that Parks and Recreation currently has. And our intention of establishing a fee policy is to have a standardized approach that is transparent to community members as well as our staff and provides clear cost recovery targets. We believe that there are several definitions and consistencies that would really simplify this approach. And then the second goal of developing a fee policy is to determine the appropriate subsidy levels for the types of programs that we offer. And this would be based on the level of funding that's available each year. All of our subsidy levels would be based on the community benefit that has been presented in the 2014 and 2022 plans. But the other intent of the fee policy is this will help us achieve national accreditation that we hope to undertake in 2024. On the next slide, we have taken information from the Parks and Recreation Plan that has very clear guidance from Council in 2014 and 2022 that identifies that taxes pay for recreation programs where the community benefits, whereas individual user fees pay for programs that are exclusive or benefit a individual. In the middle, we have just general recreation that is a combination of both taxes and user fees to really support some of the benefits that community recreation provides. On the bottom, we have started exploring what this means for cost recovery targets, and this has been an ongoing exercise with the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board, as well as our staff. We've identified that working our way from left to right, community benefit programs typically have a lower cost recovery, which is a higher subsidy, and then exclusive programs typically will have higher cost recovery where individual users are paying for their full way. Within this, there is different variations and flavors of recreation. We do have everything from beginner to intermediate to advanced, and some of our cost recovery targets will be based on who the intended audience is for each of our program types, what the reach is, and other factors that are identified in the Recreation Priority Index. We do recognize that cost escalation is having an impact on funds citywide and especially in Parks and Recreation. And we are hoping that we can create a fee policy that's equitable, but also allows for individuals to pay their way where they're benefiting from the programs that are offered. On the next slide, we've identified what the 10 different types of programs are that we offer. All of this is described in more detail in your packet on page 14, and this includes the methodology, the last time the fee was updated, and some sample definitions and examples of programs that fall into each of these program types. On the top, we have 4 different program types where there is set policy from either the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board or City Council. And for this, we are really hoping to document everything into one fee policy instead of various different policies that have been updated at different points in time. On the bottom, we have program types without a set fee policy. Our intention here is to really clarify so it is easier for community members and staff to understand how we go about charging our fees and documenting it into a single policy that is simple to refer back to for all of our individuals and user groups. This will provide general clarity and consistency. On the next slide, we've mapped out our timeline as far as the various touch points that we've had so far. Staff began working on this project in January of this year and has met with the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board monthly and continues to meet with them in addition to having staff engagement. Our intention is in June to take this to the community connectors and residents to provide our recommended approach. And then in September, we would hope to start conducting community engagement surrounding this, where we share the proposed fee increases across the board. We do want to highlight that any community or recreation programs, we would cap at a 10% fee increase for 2024 in order to be able to phase this in a way that is equitable. And we do want to highlight that none of the existing financial aid programs would be impacted by this. So the Play Pass, the Requity program would continue to maintain financial assistance for those who are in need to be able to access our programs. This really is intended to focus more on the entrepreneurial spirit that was identified in the plan to make sure that we are paying for our way through individual users, especially where they benefit. So throughout the process, we are looking at research, community engagement, and policy to drive our decisions and look forward to presenting the recommended fee policy with the 2024 budget. And I'll turn it back over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Jackson. All right, 2 more assumptions and then we're done. Uncertainty related to the expiring 0.15 general fund sales tax necessitates preservation of ongoing funding from the library reallocation. So I'll explain in a little bit more detail. We will discuss staff's recommendation a little bit later this evening, but for the 0.15 specifically, it's an undedicated general fund tax that expires at the end of 2024. There is existing policy guidance that we'll review and how we use this to fund general governmental services within the general fund that we feel provides a justification for a long-term undedicated extension of this tax. And as we'll discuss later, there's some options in terms of engaging with voters in polling prior to November. What we're looking at specifically is what happens if voters do not renew this tax, or if the tax itself is dedicated to a purpose that is not currently funded within the general fund. That will result in a budget gap. So that about $7.5 million, if we fund something to the level of, let's say, $4 million in the general fund, and that voters ultimately dedicate that to that purpose, the increment, because it's $7.5 million, would be a budget gap. Anything in the millions in terms of a general fund budget gap would be significant. We're likely looking at budget cuts in the realm of services and the people associated with that. So the 0.15 and caution around that 0.15 is one of the major things that we're thinking about for 2024 budget development. So to that end, our suggestion is to hold back a portion of the library reallocation dollars. The top 3 are items you already saw. The bottom line would be a general contingency for ongoing funding for any potential gap created by either a non-renewal or a dedication of the 0.15. So that would take us to about the amount that we would expect to have available for library funds, knowing that if voters choose to renew the tax undedicated, then we would have that $4 million available for ongoing needs. After that, if we had some type of different financing model for Alpine Balsam, there could be resources there. And then as Charlotte spoke to earlier, at watching property tax very, very closely is another example. There are potential opportunities in the future. At the time of budget development, we'll have to proceed with some degree of caution. And lastly, as we talk about seemingly every week, the needs are simply greater than the funding that we have available. So one thing that we have explored preliminarily with the Financial Strategy Committee is a long-term financial strategy across all funds and city functions. I've shown iterations of this list before. The dollar numbers are big. When we asked departments and tried to be pretty specific about the types of things we were asking for related to library reallocation resources, a number of maintenance needs, other core operations across the system ranges into the $20–30 million range, in addition to a number of other things that we're already moving forward in some way, whether it's related to fleet electrification, facilities repairs, advanced life support and fire. And then there's a number of ARPA funded initiatives that, while funded through 2025, implicate perhaps future funding as well. So what do we rely on in order to look at a long-term financial strategy? Well, there is previous policy guidance all the way back to 2008 and 2010. We had a Blue Ribbon Commission that focused on sustainable revenues. There were a few lessons learned there, specifically our reliance on sales tax, shying away from dedicated funding, and also moving forward on budgeting for outcomes, which is something that we have done over that period of time with our budgeting for resilience effort. Our work there has also pointed out many different areas that we can continue to improve upon from a budgeting perspective, but also memorialize some of the work that we are doing in terms of an outcome focus. We learned lessons through the pandemic that we spoke about this evening. The reliance on sales tax was highlighted through that downturn, and also our ability to contingency plan so that any disruption is less impactful to the organization and community. There are other emerging budget policy issues that we have spoken with council about in the past. I mentioned dedicated revenues. That is something we are currently in the middle of analyzing and bringing forward to help with 24 budget development. Our master plan funding levels continue to be something that we want to make sure that that tool is appropriate for the types of expectations that we're setting with each plan, and for those that have been accepted, to make sure that we set forth a realistic funding expectation going forward. And I mentioned ARPA. And then lastly, a strategy, or at least certain elements of a strategy, could help us approach a recommendation for the 0.15, which you'll hear about in a bit. Long-term financial strategy could have many different elements. There are a few that we expect to be a part of a strategy. The confirmation of our fiscal philosophy as a city, so the sales and property tax balance, dedicated funding appropriateness, these things would help guide us over a long period of time, right? When any type of decision comes up, we can lean on a strategy that we've developed and confirming some of that philosophy. I mentioned memorializing our outcome-based approach, setting some general parameters to overall taxing levels. We're at the high end in terms of sales tax regionally. Is that appropriate? Are we comfortable being at that high end? Property tax, we have a mill levy maximum set in charter. Is that appropriate? Should we be moving towards that or not? Those types of things would be elements in a strategy. And then last, aligning all of our budget practices and processes to that strategy would be an element. Next steps include continuing to make progress on a number of different research items or analysis that relate to a number of these issues. We would like to continue to engage FSC and Council on Strategy Development throughout the year, looking at a target in late 23, early 24 for an initial draft. And we do think that the work heading into the 24 budget can help inform budget prioritization, so that even though there is uncertainty related to property tax, library reallocation, the 0.15, that if those fall in a way that is of a windfall from a budget perspective, that we use the budget process in its full context to identify what those key priorities are and be able to move quickly if we receive clarity from voters at the state level and at the local level in November. All right. that's the 6 of them. I won't read them again, but happy to take down the slides and see if council has any questions.
Bob Yates wins the Speedy Hand Raise Award. You're up.
Thanks. I had the advantage of having seen the slides or some of the slides in the Financial Strategy Committee before, so I had to jump on people. Mark, or anybody who knows this question, you touched briefly earlier in the presentation on the potential revenue increase to the city as a result of the property assessments, and I know those just came out, and I realize that there are some ballot measures that Colorado voters will vote on that will have some impact on that. Do you guys have a range, like a low end or a higher end range? In other words, if some of these ballot measures pass, what's the low end, and if they don't pass, what's the high end? Or is it premature for you guys to do that math?
Yeah, we do, at least for if voters decided not to provide any relief. I believe that's around $7 to $10 million in terms of extra above our original projections that would be coming in 24. The others, in terms of the potential items that voters could approve, range pretty widely, I believe, and Charlotte will correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was anywhere from a couple $1 million impact in the governor's proposal, all the way to a net negative in collections for another that was a little bit more limiting in terms of the year-over-year growth in property tax revenues or collections.
Thanks, Mark. That's helpful. So how are you guys going to deal with that from the standpoint of preparing the 2024 budget? Because obviously we'll have to prepare the budget and approve the budget long before the November votes. Are you guys going to take kind of a worst case scenario approach, and then there might be some upside that we could do adjustments to base in 2024? How are you going to deal with that given the timing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's something that we still have to have some discussions about. We probably wouldn't take the most conservative approach based on what would be on the ballot. However, we will have to proceed with caution. And so I think you're right that we'll use the budget process. We'll have a set of priorities that kind of fall right below that line that we are able to budget to. And in the event that voters take a less restrictive action in November, we'll be ready at the first of the year to move forward on those priorities.
Great. Thanks, Mark. That's all I had.
Bob, Aaron Brockett.
Well, Bob, you teed up my question perfectly because I'm also pursuing the property tax questions. But first, I want to thank you all for a very detailed presentation, but also just, I just think you're doing a phenomenal job in terms of how you're budgeting and how you're thinking about estimates and tapping fund balance and making sure we're funding community priorities when we have the money available. So huge thanks for the way that you're approaching things. I'm a huge fan of how that's going. So my question on the property tax is, Bob asked part of it, but in terms of the HH that the legislature is putting on the ballot, are they not backfilling lost revenue to cities as part of that? So do you know how much of an impact it was had? Because I thought they were going to make us partially, if not entirely whole in that case.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. That's a good question. So the Senate bill that went through last year, that did provide backfill for Boulder. So that capped the assessment rate at a certain amount. And we will be provided this year 65% backfill of what we would have otherwise lost. There is a backfill provision in HH. I do believe that we are not included in that. And I think there is is it a population threshold, or it's the percentage increase over our assessments? Is that right, Charlotte?
That's correct. Yeah.
Oh, so sorry, Charlotte, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add the percentage increase is 20%. And so if a jurisdiction is above that, then they would not receive the backfill.
Got it. Okay. Thanks for helping me to understand that. So that would have an impact to us, in other words. And then you said there's a more dire version. And is that the initiative that's gathering signatures right now that has been proposed?
That's correct. I know that there's one that limits, I think it's 3% year over year growth or something like that. Just to give you a frame of reference, our original projections in the 23 budget, so all the way back during 2022, we had anticipated about a 10% growth in assessed values in 24. So if it was only 3%, then we would have to figure that one out.
Okay. So
And I'll
sorry, go ahead, Carl.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in here that we'll see this in the next agenda item, but there are 4 initiatives that are out for collecting signatures, and so they vary in terms of the limitations, and most of them are tied around that 3%, but some of them have varying conditions. So.
Okay, so if they gather enough signatures and they pass, then we'll be hit pretty hard. So definitely something to keep an eye on. But the approach you described, Mark, sounds like a really good one in your answer to Bob. Thanks very much. That's all I got.
Thanks, Aaron. Matt?
Thanks, Rachel. And Mark, Kara, Charlotte, thank you for that. That was really, really detailed and quite helpful to get that landscape. Some great opportunity, but also some risk in front of us. So sort of, both sides of the coin. Bob touched my property tax questions, so I appreciate him jumping out with that. The only remainder one I had to do with kind of what eligibility for CCRS. Clearly, it's between parks and fire stations, some of that stuff that was clearly defined when CCRS got passed. I'm wondering, does the capital investment for the day service center apply, and would that even be something in part or full that we would consider in CCRS in terms of making that more immediate investment, where some of those other capital investments are still longer term out?
Yeah, good question, Matt. The short answer is it could. We could certainly use CCRS to fund the day services center. Day service, the way we structured CCRS, just to step back for a moment, is very flexible. We kind of said, here's the list of projects and other things, right? So it's a balance between what we set in terms of voter expectation, right? Community expectation that we would address a number of the items listed versus the flexibility as things come up over the life of a 15-year tax. So that's some of what we'll be weighing and developing a funding plan under CCRS for the 24 budget. For the Day Services Center, we have a general strategy right now. That capital cost is estimated at $10 million, 5 of which would come from the Affordable Housing Fund, and then 5 from the general fund. And so we think that's adequate. Now we'll also research potential grant opportunities. We do have some period of time before we'll break ground. But your point is valid. We certainly could tap CCRS if we ran into a situation where we couldn't use general fund money.
Yeah, I appreciate you looking into. I'm just hearing some of these potential consequences of shortfalls. It just makes me think that if we can free up $5 million, then that's people we don't have to furlough and programs we don't have to suspend or cancel. So I'm sure you guys are on top of that. But thanks for clarifying that.
That all, Matt? Tara?
Okay, well, first question was already answered, why we couldn't use the fund from affordable housing for the day center, and it looks like we can, 5 million, yay. There's 2 things that are on my mind. And first of all, there's probably an easy answer to this, but I'm thinking about the parks presentation and the continual rising of the fees, which, considering that our buildings are not in great shape, I don't know how well it sits with the community to keep raising our fees. So is there no room for getting more budget for parks so that we don't have to keep raising our fees? I don't know if maybe somebody from Parks is here I know that the Parks board has probably talked about it, because when I was on that board, we sure did. So I'm wondering what our plan is for that. And we've also had a lot of emails from the South Boulder Rec Center folks. And so I'm wondering, is this the time to talk about any of those things, or is there a better day, a better time day? Allie.
Yeah, I'm happy to yield to Allie and Jackson. I'll just say one thing that we do hope to begin to address in the 24 budget plan, especially our capital improvement program, is beginning to think about our long range facilities planning. And you're right, we have to figure out the best approach to our recreation centers. We do think CCRS will certainly help, but may not get us all the way there. So it's certainly a valid question. Allie, Jackson, do you want to? jump in there?
Tara, we have taken this to PRAB, and some of PRAB's input addressed a lot of the similar concerns you have, increasing costs and what it means with aging facilities compared to some of our peer communities. I think that in recreation, we have different alternatives. We can reduce our level of services, we can increase prices, or we can look at the volume at which we're delivering our services. So all of those are options on the table. And then as it relates back to the age of the recreation centers, I think that Mark touched on it, and I believe in 2 weeks you'll have a greater study session talking more about taking care of our facilities.
So is increasing the budget for parks not even in the discussion? Is one of those 3 options that you gave us only, and not increasing the budget then? Because right now people are complaining they don't have enough, the facilities aren't open enough. You know, you've been all reading the emails. And so I don't know that I'm thinking about the community who values our rec center so much, and it's used across the board with all incomes. Everybody loves our rec centers. And I'm just thinking, did PRAB say that a good option would be to cut our services even more?
The PRAB said that they wanted to maintain the current levels of services being provided. And then I think back to the general fund subsidy, that has historically been about $1.6 million. And there was a one-time increase in both 2022 and 2023, with the understanding that it was only one-time in nature. So our intention is that that would reduce back to 1.6 million, or the historical amount beginning in 2024.
Tara?
I don't know. I mean, I guess there's another time to talk about it, not now. I guess that's it. My last question is, unless Allie, you have anything to add to make me feel better, or not really?
I'd love to say something to make you feel better. I think Jackson's answer was really well done. The very best thing that could happen to relieve the pressure is for visitation to return to pre-pandemic levels. It's not there. We have program areas that are knocking it out of the park. Gymnastics is actually exceeding 2019 levels. They are incredible. You're going to see an ATV next week that actually adds a position to support their success. We're leaning in everywhere we can. We keep talking about, rather than pushing the rock uphill, where can we put rolling really well. But the reality is, until we can solve this lifeguard crisis, the limitation in visitation is really hamstringing us, and we're doing everything we can to figure it out. So if it makes you feel better, we have the best team. They are so stinking smart, and they're trying really hard.
That does make me feel better. Thanks, Allie.
Do you have one more question, Tara?
Yes, I do. My last question is, I had a discussion with transportation after we got quite a lot of emails about the condition of our roads, because that affects both bikers and drivers. And I'm wondering if there's any room to increase. They said that we actually do not have a lot of budget for fixing our roads. I won't even say who, but they did say that. And so I'm wondering, is there any room to increase the budget for fixing our roads, which are not in great shape, as far as I can tell on my bike?
Yeah, fair question. I think you're hitting on a couple things that speak to the tension that we always feel going into a budget development, right? There's so many different priorities, and we have constraints, and especially those that are supported by the general fund, we simply have limited resources to be able to do that. I don't know if that makes you feel better, but I think we have the opportunity to try and address these priorities. And if transportation says, hey, look, we're falling behind on our condition index in our streets, here's what it would take to improve that. That's something that would be brought forward during the 24 budget, and in the context of all of the different priorities that we see. So yes, in short, absolutely, it's something we could address, and those are the types of things, transportation, parks funding, et cetera, that we'll look at all together and figure out how to best address during budget development.
Thanks, Tara. Nicole, and then Mark.
Thank you. And I also have a lot of questions like Tara, but try to go quickly and be discerning. First of all, thank you. This is just such an exciting time to be on council. I think reading through the packet, seeing your presentation really highlights that, just to be around as some of this budgeting for resilience and equity is starting to impact how we make these financial decisions. I think the focus on outcomes-based budgeting is going to be such a help to future councils in terms of deciding what to pursue, especially as costs go up and revenues may not. And I know we aren't done with all this work, but I just wanted to thank you for everything you're doing to support this transition. And also just applaud your efforts to navigate the challenge of having all of these significant uncertainties for next year. That is really hard. And we're going to have some hard decisions and conversations coming up, but really appreciate everything you're doing to try to find a way through when you don't really know which direction we're headed in right now. I had a couple of questions. First, just about the Parks and Rec, the user fees and things. And one of the things I was wondering is in setting our fee structure and kind of looking at our use rates, do we compare ourselves to similar facilities in the area or across the mountain region?
We typically look at the user fees individually each year as we set our fees. As we were setting the 2023 fees, we are the highest on the Front Range by a relatively far margin. We're currently charging $9 for an adult resident daily drop-in, which is what we base all of our fees off of. And most peer communities are in the $5 to $6 per visit range currently. And then for individual program fees, we do rely on the Recreation Priority Index that takes into account what is the benefit for individuals. We look at market rate data from other providers of those services, both local government, municipalities, and for-profit agencies. So we are trying to remain competitive in the marketplace without undercharging or overcharging our customers because we recognize the value of community recreation.
Thank you. And one more question along those lines, and this may be, just let me know if this is a discussion for a later point. I'm just really curious to unpack a little bit more of this idea of exclusive uses and kind of, differentiate how community benefit plays into that. I mean, when we were talking about the master plan, thinking about it last fall, I was thinking about exclusive uses as being like more corporate, for-profit kinds of things, not necessarily recreation uses like we heard about from, the rowers who are being priced out a little bit. And I am just wondering about especially programs that are targeting youth and emerging adults. It is so valuable to have these ages physically active and outdoors in the community. The impacts on brain development, psychological health, cognitive function, I mean, they last a lifetime, right? And so as we're kind of thinking about for this year, and this is probably not the point for it, but just where can we have a discussion about, what is included in exclusive versus recreation use, and how are we thinking about the health benefits and impacts on the folks who are participating?
I'll chime in and take that one, because here's the challenge, Nicole, is that the very first litmus test in everything we do is it mission driven? And our mission is to promote health and well-being. And so everything we do in some way or another does that, right? I was out at East Mapleton on Tuesday night seeing adult softball. Some of our members of council can speak to the lifelong benefits of adult volleyball. And yet funds are limited, and so we have to make choice about where subsidy goes. And so I hear you that what you thought was exclusive maybe isn't how it's playing out, and do we need to keep working on the nuance? Yes, but at the end of the day, as much as we would love everything to be free, that's not the reality of the world that we're in. And so we do have the other thing we know in our community, which is wonderful, is people are passionate about their form of recreation, whatever it might be. And so what the Recreation Priority Index does is it says, how many people is this serving? Is there substitutability for this service? What targeted benefits is it providing? What targeted communities is it serving? And so that's how we do it, because we do have to have an objective way. This is a recommendation from 2008 and in the throes of the last recession, is how do you objectively determine where the subsidy goes? And that's the tool that we have, and we'd be happy to share it with you more. Now's probably not the time, but we'll defer to council on if and how you might want to dive in deeper on that. We're certainly diving in deep with the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board.
Yeah, thank you for that. Appreciate it. Those are all my Parks and Rec questions, but I've got a couple more for some others. I know we're including the connectors in the budgeting discussions this year. Are we getting any feedback yet? Are there any kind of themes emerging from some of those conversations?
Yeah, we have, and we just really appreciate the partnership with our community connectors and residents. It's been a really valuable discussion over the last couple of months. I'll invite Charlotte to add on to this. I think the major themes we're hearing are about affordability in community and about advancing our equity goals. In line with themes that connectors have shared with council before. And what we did this time around is really focus in on certain outcomes that we can put into our budget terms and help guide departments as they develop budgets over the next couple of months. So that it'll be helpful in this first stage to set that frame, and then we'll check back again to see how we're doing once we get close to releasing the recommended budget.
Thank you. Just a related question. Do we get feedback from the Human Relations Commission as well on the budget, or will we this year?
We certainly can during that second window, and we can do some thinking about the best format for that. But yes, that's absolutely possible.
Thank you. And I was just wondering, especially just given the storms that have been coming through lately and hearing from what some folks in East County experienced in a climate crisis, capital improvement costs, infrastructure costs certainly seem like they are going up. Is that something that we take into account in our budgeting every year as we're thinking about these kind of big ticket repairs and things that are going to have to be done and done more frequently in the coming decades?
Yes, it is. And I think one of the things that our facilities master plan highlights is in the city buildings, the importance of consolidation and being strategic about which facilities that we target for major investment, that it's done with that climate action focus. There are many other ways that I'm sure that our climate initiatives folks could expand on in terms of working with community. I know specifically the efforts related to the voter-approved expansion of the climate tax to include wildfire resilience is one of those efforts in building community connections and helping related to resilience efforts. So yes, it's something we think about a lot, and a huge reason why we center our objectives, our outcomes on the sustainability, resilience, and equity framework to make sure that we're laser focused on that.
Thank you. And then last question, also kind of a bigger, longer term question. You know, we're already seeing some of these demographic shifts that are expected in Colorado, of just a growth in the 65 and older population relative to others. I expect that's going to have some revenue impacts. Is that anything that's motivating some of this shift? You know, that you all are starting to talk about not being quite so reliant on sales tax and having other forms of revenue that help our budget be a little bit more balanced and resilient?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think with our over reliance on sales tax, one of the concerns is from an equity perspective of who's paying the majority of the taxes. The shift to balancing more with property tax is maybe tougher today than it was a few years ago, but you know, certainly would be more sustainable from a revenue perspective. And then there are other ways, other strategies. Another reason to highlight a long-term financial strategy in looking at the structure of sales and use tax, looking at different types of fees that are perhaps a little bit more equitable, and then again figuring out what a long-term shift to more property tax looks like, and if there's a palette for that. So yeah, in short, it's something we think about, but also would be good to outline in a long-term financial strategy so that when opportunities come up, we're always thinking in the same frame of mind.
Great, thank you. That's all.
Thanks, Nicole. Mark?
Thank you. As always, a very substantive and clear presentation. Thank you, guys. It was terrific. I only have 3 questions. Has there been any discussion about monetizing the use of our open space, parking fees or otherwise, especially with respect to the many folks who come in from Denver and out of town to use the land that we have to pay for the maintenance of?
That is a good question, Mark. I don't know for sure. I know there has been some work done around parking management at trailheads, but we'd have to get back to you on, unless there's somebody else on the call that can speak to that, on whether or not we've looked at a fee structure or something along those lines.
If someone could get back, that would be nice. My second question is, can you speak a little more about what you're planning to do with dedicated fund balances, in what amount, and I mean, are you looking to eliminate those fund balances so that we can absorb it into the general fund? What do you have in mind?
Yeah, good question. So to be clear, the dedicated funds, especially those that have voter restrictions, we wouldn't be changing those restrictions. We would be staying in line with voter intent, voter action related to those fees. So we're simply just making sure, one, we're sticking to the language, either in the ballot or in code language that restricts the use. So we're not restricting ourselves further in terms of the uses. And then also making sure that the fund balance levels are appropriate. So looking over the time horizon, 5-6 years down the road, are we building in the ongoing resources that we can for every fund? Just like last year, we really focused on the general fund and our sales and use tax structure and maximizing the use of our resources there. We want to make sure we're doing the same things in those dedicated funds. So it wouldn't be taking away from those funds to fund something else that they couldn't. It would just be making sure that we're truly investing to the best of our ability within those specific areas.
Okay, thank you. And I guess my last question is, looking at the inexorable growth in terms of expenses and costs, whether it's capital expenditures or personnel or maintenance, and the limitations on our ability to continue to increase the pie in terms of revenues. We're becoming we are a very high tax city. We simply couldn't go back and, I think, increase sales taxes more. And I don't know if you start looking at how people are yelling and screaming about the prospective increase in their property taxes, I just don't know how much more there is there. Are we approaching a position where we have a structural deficit between our revenues and our expenses? Because we're increasing our expenses on a yearly basis, new programs, increases in old programs, and I'm not sure that the revenues, except sometimes we get a break with sales taxes, are going to be commensurate to fund all of those activities. And so, are we now looking for exotic financial gimmickry to get us back into balance?
No to that last part, but I will say that every year when we develop the budget, we make sure that we have a sustainable 5 or 6 year time horizon in our financials, meaning there's no structural deficit. You will see a structural deficit this year when we produce the fund financials for the general fund because of the expiring 0.15. So that's $7.5 million of ongoing revenue that we're not demonstrating. If that were to be disrupted, then absolutely we'd have to look at reductions in order to offset that amount. But to your point, I think it's something we look at every year, right? The balance of our ongoing spending versus how we're projecting sales and use and other revenues. I think one of the main purposes of looking at a long-term financial strategy is understanding what areas we do have flexibility in, where can we start broadening the pie, to your point, and then really leaning into the work with outcomes so that if something is not aligned with our goals, then we can look at realigning resources within. And I think that's something we've begun to start to think about, but are just kind of getting at the point where we feel like we have data and information to do that in a better way. And I see Nuria's hand.
I'm just concerned that that you're going to need to exercise the creativity of Picasso to address some of these concerns. But
thank God we have Picasso as staff members.
Right?
I say that Nuria has her hand up, so she may have a part answer for you too, Mark.
I did, and actually Mark took the words out of my mouth in terms of like, it is an ask that we continue to sort of lift up both to staff, but also to you. I'll say that as we move into outcome-based budgeting, the goal of that is to use data that tells us what can we stop doing so that we can think about things that we should really augment that are working or new projects that are coming, because it is unsustainable to keep being additive in a budget process. And saying no, or we're going to shift, or we're going to reprioritize is not something cities do really well. And I think data really helps and supports that. So as we get that data in, as we are transforming our budget process to incorporate that, and we come to council in the next iteration of budgeting for resilience, it is that conversation that we really need your partnership on as we're moving forward, because that's what's going to make a difference as we move forward. That's my plea for next year.
Thank you for that answer, Nuria.
I see Cara has her hand up, and Mark, I don't mean to cut you off if you have other questions.
Well, thank you. I just also wanted to double down on what Mark and Nuria shared, but then to also reiterate with regard to the long-term financial strategy. We do think part of that is really to have an open and sort of broad community conversation about priorities. I mean, I think we all agree that through our traditional master plan process, we have identified a lot of goals and had sort of the conversations with those respective constituencies, but we haven't really had an overarching community conversation about priorities, because frankly, we cannot afford everything that is identified in all of those plans. And so we need to say that out loud, and we need to have a conversation about how to prioritize across those many needs. But so we really do look forward to that long-term financial strategy development and that conversation.
Thanks, Cara. Tara, double dipping?
Sorry, real quick. So in regards to our pilot programs, I'm not saying that the guaranteed income program will be great, but I did notice that it went from pilot to ongoing needs. And that's just an example of, I guess my question is how do we prioritize? It's always hard. How do we prioritize some great social programs with, for instance, infrastructure, crumbling buildings, roads, et cetera. So do we have, how many pilot programs do we have where we have to make the decision whether or not to continue that we used the ARPA funds for?
Really good question. I would say, in general, we do not do piloting well. As a city, we do tend to keep those investments going. For ARPA, we do have a real conversation. Those are resources made to help us recover from the pandemic, and I think were appropriate and exciting investments. We have not made a determination on guaranteed income in some of our other pilot programs. We will have to, as to whether or not those are permanent programs. I think where we'd like to really focus in on, and this gets back to the outcome-based approach, is if we set something as a pilot and fund it with one-time dollars and establish some of our intended outcomes, we want to make sure we're measuring that, and then report back to council and community at the end to say, did we achieve our goals? Is this something that should continue, or did it run its course? We've recovered from the pandemic in this area, and it's not something that could continue. I hope that we'll get to the point with our pilot programs where if it's a true pilot, then we'll be able to provide that data and then make an informed decision on whether or not we're extending that into the future.
I mean, I remember back in the day when we first talked about it, we were wondering if we shouldn't use those funds to give to EFA. So, and then we switched over to the pilot. I'm not saying it is not good or better than giving money to EFA. I'm just hoping that we can look at those pilot programs, even though cities notoriously don't. I hope we would be one of those cities that do. Just throwing that out there.
Thanks, Tara. So I think that the question that staff put to us was, do we have any questions? And I think that we have asked our questions. So going once, twice, three times to try and keep us on our 3-hour schedule here. So thank you so much, Cara and Mark and Charlotte and Jackson, who has disappeared from my screen. That was outstanding presentation and information. And if no one has any more questions, which I'm going to pretend I see no hands if they do go up, let's move right on to topic number 2. Staff, though I do want to check in with you, Cara, maybe. Just make sure that you got what you needed from us.
Yes, we did. Thank you very much. We
Perfect.
appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I'll turn it back over to Nuria then to take us to ballot measures.
Well, lest you thought you had enough of finance team, actually, we're gonna send that right back to Cara, who's gonna kick us off on that. And I so appreciate you keeping us on schedule.
Yes, thank you. And I believe the presentation should be coming up. Thank you, Emily. Very much appreciated. So the next agenda item is to talk about potential ballot measures, and you will see from this slide that we have a number of city staff as well as the Council Charter Review Committee. They're going to help guide us through this discussion. Next slide. So we do have 6 items on the agenda, and the first, the second, and the 5th are items that we are going to request feedback and input direction from City Council. So we have questions teed up for that. Items 3, 4, and 6 are really just updates. So with that, I'm gonna, next slide. So for here, I believe I'm gonna hand it over to Erin Poe, and she's gonna start this, but then I believe the Charter Review Committee is also going to join her in leading this discussion.
Thank you very much, Kara. Good evening, Mayor and members of Council. Erin Poe, Deputy City Attorney. For this segment of the presentation, I will be covering Charter Review Committee recommendations and bringing forward an issue for discussion. Next slide, please. The Charter Review Committee recommends changes to Charter Provisions 27, 37, 39, 46, and 57. The goal of these changes is to remove a requirement for in-person signatures in support of mayoral or city council candidates, to provide the city clerk 5 additional days to process petitions. This would be done by increasing the number of days to process from 10 to 15 and changing the deadline to submit petition signatures from 150 days before the election to 155 days before the election. And thirdly, to clarify language providing that state law governs amendments to the city charter. And I'll pause there to see if council members Yates or Benjamin would like to add anything to those recommendations. All right, thank you. Next slide, please. The Charter Review Committee considered other recommendations brought by community members, but those are not recommended this election cycle. These are proportional representation and modifying the initiative and referendum process regarding the number of signatures required. And again, I'll pause to see if our council members would like to add anything to this slide. All right, thank you. Next slide, please. So for this segment, these are our questions for council. Do you agree with the recommendations of the City Council Charter Review Committee? Does the council have direction regarding polling on Charter Review Committee recommendations? And/or should staff draft ordinances with proposed ballot language for the Charter Review Committee recommended ballot measures?
You ready for us to dig into those?
You bet.
Okay, let's take them one at a time. I guess maybe we can do a show of hands for question 1, a straw poll first. Oh, they disappeared. Okay. Do you agree with the recommendation of the City Council Charter Review Committee? Who agrees? Great. Does anyone have questions on that one? I guess I didn't give us questions first. Awesome. Any other questions you want to ask before we dig into 2 and 3? 2, does the council have direction regarding polling on any of the Charter Review Committee recommended ballot measures? Aaron, I think I see your hand.
guess I'll just kick us off with a potential position of no need to poll on these because they don't seem kind of controversial enough to require a poll. So I'll put that out as a recommendation.
Anyone have a counter recommendation? Can I see a show of hands for who likes Aaron's recommendation? I think I see all hands. Great. Anything else anyone wants to say on number 2? Aaron, you have what you need on that one? Oh, Nicole?
I was just going to ask staff, you don't have a different recommendation from that, do you? There's nothing we're missing? Okay, thank you.
No.
All right, number 3, should staff draft ordinances with proposed ballot language for the Charter Review Committee recommended ballot measures? Anyone want to comment on that first? Otherwise, we're already seeing thumbs up. Okay, show of hands. Yes, to draft the ordinances. Mark Wallach, you look a little skeptical, but I'm counting you. Okay. Thanks. Any questions on those 3? Does this go back to Aaron?
Goes back to me. Yes. Thank you very much. Okay. And for the next segment of the presentation, the Charter Review Committee has flagged an issue of council compensation for discussion. Council compensation in 2022 was $12,695 annually. An increase in compensation would recognize the escalating workload and increased complexity of council work. The time commitment for council work may be a barrier to service, and increasing compensation may enable more people to afford to serve. Fort Collins enacted council compensation based on the area median income in 2022 as shown on the slide. And I'll pause to turn to council members Yates and Benjamin to provide additional information. And the next slide has questions for council to consider.
Thanks, Aaron. Matt and I are divvying this up. Matt has something to present to council a little later in the presentation, so I'll take this one on with Matt's assistance. So as Aaron mentioned, Fort Collins last year, pretty quickly actually, did a compensation change. They were right around the same level we were, around $11,000 or $12,000 a year. They had a study session last April, similar to what we're talking about tonight, and their council said, let's go forward and give a ballot measure, which they did in November. You see the numbers there on the slide, between 50 and 75% of the area median income, and that was approved by the voters in Fort Collins in November with a 62% positive vote, and actually went into effect January 1, so they did it pretty darn quick. The Charter Committee is not necessarily recommending that here for this year or at any point in time. We just wanted to call to your attention the fact that at least one of our neighboring peer cities has made a pretty significant change in their compensation for council members. Just by way of comparison, if you did the math, the $12,000 or so that our council gets paid is roughly 15% of the area median income for a single person. So Fort Collins is running about 3 to 5 times higher than that. We have not done a comparative study of other cities other than just some anecdotal examinations. Matt and Mark did host a kind of a gathering of some former council members last week just to get a sense from them about what they thought about a potential compensation change. There have been 3 attempts at compensation changes before the voters since we required a charter amendment. Over the last 20 years, there's been 3 attempts. All of those have been voted down. There's been some modest changes like health insurance and the method of payments, but the voters have consistently not approved pay increases in Boulder. The half dozen to a dozen former council members that Mark and Matt hosted last week had divergent opinions about whether there should be a compensation change. That ran anywhere from no change to potentially a slight change to potentially a change similar to what Fort Collins did, to even, I think, one former council member recommended going to 100% of AMI. So, and Matt did a good job of summarizing those various opinions in a hotline that he did a day or 2 ago. And so this is really just kind of a touch in. We haven't really spent a whole lot of staff time on this. This is not really something that was highlighted as a priority at the council retreat, but something that Matt and I have, as Charter Committee, have been working a little bit on. And I guess what we're just looking for some direction from council tonight. This is kind of a green, yellow, red, which is, green is if there was enthusiasm by a majority on council to try to put something on the 2023 ballot. We could certainly burst into flames and work on that very hard and very quickly over the next couple of months with the assistance of staff, and bring something back to council in June and July. We'd need some direction about what AMI levels you'd be seeking, and undoubtedly we'd want to do some polling in parallel with the polling that staff is going to do on some other ballot measures. That'd be kind of the green approach. The oranger approach would be, yeah, this sounds kind of interesting, probably not enough time to do something this year, or maybe politically it's not a good year to do it this year, but keep working on it, charter committee, and let's talk about it later this year, or maybe take some recommendations to the next council retreat in January for a possible 2024 ballot measure. And then red would be no, thanks for looking into this, Matt and Bob, but this doesn't look like it's something we want to do at this time, and the next council can decide if they want to pick it up or not. So that's the direction that Matt and I are really seeking from you. Is, like I said, we've just done a little bit of work. We want to know if you want us to keep working on it, if you want us to stop working on it. Again, we haven't used much staff time. We would need a nod of 5 or some sort of council indication if we want to engage staff in this more over the next few months. So I'll pause there. Matt, is there anything on that one that I've left out?
No, Bob, you summarized that quite well. And assuming people read the hotline and listened to your summary, I think everything's there for everyone to kind of dive in.
Okay, go ahead.
No, I was just going to turn it back to you, Rachel, and just maybe we'll see if we can get some discussion going.
All right, so in a minute we can ask, like, I think that the questions that are up are not really, we're not answering all 3. It's one, we'll take a vote on who wants 1, 2, or 3. So it's, do we want to look at it this year, next year, or not at all, as I understand it. But first, does anyone have questions? Tara, do you have a question?
Included in this, are we going to discuss another option would be to lessen some of the workload? So those of us that want to continue to work either full or part-time can do that. Because once you say, okay, well, let's increase it to 43,000, are you saying that we should quit our jobs because this will now be our full-time job? So I don't know what's the best thing, but I feel like that should be part of the discussion. There might be some simple things that we can do to lessen the workload so that we can keep things the way they are or slightly increase them, but also so we can keep our jobs, because some of us have worked for a very long time with our careers, and to just for 2 to 6 years or whatever to throw it out seems like a big deal as well. So I'm just throwing that out there for a discussion point. I'm not sure if we are going to talk about it or not.
Is that, just want to clarify, do you have a question that you'd like staff to answer on that?
No, I have a question I want the charter committee to answer.
Would you like us to answer that, Tara?
Yes, I would.
Oh, I mean, I can take it, Bob, unless you want to.
Well, yeah, I think it's a good discussion, Tara. I think it's important to identify the fact that this is not about what effective hourly rate council members get paid. In other words, obviously, if you reduce the hours, hourly rate would go up. I think it's fine to have a discussion at some point in time about workloads and council efficiency and whether we serve on too many committees and so on and so forth. I think that's all a fine discussion. I think the reason Matt and I teed this up, however, was a little different. It was really about equity. It was really about, are we paying council members, future council members, a sufficiently high wage so that they could consider running for council and serving on council if they had day jobs, they had children to raise, and so on and so forth. So this was less about how much we work, which is a fine discussion to have at some point, and more about, are we paying a wage or stipend that's high enough that people in our community who are not represented by the 9 of us, are who we are, might consider running for council. So I think that's really what we're shooting for here. Matt, any add on to that?
No, I mean, not necessarily. I think the only thing I would necessarily is the attempt is to eliminate economics as a barrier to entry to serve our community in the capacity we're fortunate enough to do so in. And letting it be not about your economic status, but being about a competition of ideas and values, and letting it be squarely in that arena and not what economic class you are, were or currently or aspire to be in, and just removing that from the calculus is really the core of this. And to Terry, your point, the idea on the other side of the equation is something we should absolutely discuss. I will say that I've watched council toy with that idea of reducing and modifying workload, and it kind of just becomes an exercise of futility. So happy to talk about it again, but I'd maybe defer to our more longer tenured council members like Aaron and Bob and Rachel and Mark and Junie as to where that has transpired in the past as a lesson for the future.
Thanks, Bob and Matt. Tara, you can circle back at discussion if you'd like to, but I'm going to see if Nicole and Lauren have hands up for questions. So Nicole, it's yours.
Thank you. Just questions, right? No comments yet? Okay. Do we have a plan to get feedback from people who couldn't run for council because of the lack of pay? I know we talked to folks who did and were able to.
That's a great point, Nicole, and I think that would be part of the community engagement. If council tonight gives us either a green or orange light, that is, you want to try to put something on the ballot this year, or at least tee things up for the 2024 ballot, absolutely, that's a cohort we'd want to sit down and understand things from, but we have not done that yet.
Okay, and I think this may be a question for staff. Do we have time to run this through the racial equity tool, get feedback from connectors, do some of that kind of stuff in the next month or two?
I'm not sure that I'm the one who can answer that. So I guess I might look to Nuria about staff capacity.
I'll say that I myself have not been engaged in that conversation, and happy to circle back and let council know, because I do not know what that would look like in terms of staff capacity to do that type of engagement. So we can certainly get back to council about it.
Can I ask a clarifying? Sorry, I was going to ask a clarifying of Nicole's question, but you're moderating, so you.
I was just going to colloquy. Go ahead. I'll do that after.
So my clarifying question for you, Nicole, is certainly, the time crunch of the next couple months is on the assumption we'd want to put it on the ballot in 2023. And so it's a different thing if we want to do it in 2024 and we got some runway. And so I'm just sort of curious if there's a qualifier in how we would achieve that in terms of how staff would thus then respond if we've got 2 months versus a little bit longer to make sure we have a little bit more of a deeper engagement. Because I think, like all of us, we don't want to do the engagement in such a limited and light fashion that we actually don't get the input that we're actually is meaningful. So I just want to just put that out that 2 tracks would maybe dictate what we can and can't do. So I just throwing that back.
Yeah, and I think that's where my question was coming from, right? Do we have enough time in a month or two to do the kind of meaningful engagement that we would want to do, given the groups that we're trying to make this apply to? So for me, it's kind of a question that does impact the feedback that I have about how we move forward tonight.
If I can colloquy real quick, to staff, will anybody be running for council in 2024? Like, is there any reason to do this year so that people, usually we make it so that you get it's only the next incoming class who reaps the benefits of something that we promote to the ballot. So we wouldn't have our own salaries raised. It would be the next people elected. So is there any reason to do it this year time-wise in terms of having it done before the next group cohort would run for council? When is the next council and mayor election after this year?
2025 is the next council election. 2026 would be the next mayoral election. But maybe I can answer qualifier, because I think that maybe gets to some of the commentary or motives of what maybe where the recommendations are. But I think it's a fair point you bring up, Rachel, about that, because one of the reasons why we would consider moving it into 2024 is to not create that awkward conflict in a council election year where you've got council members running and then weighing in on whether or not they want to pay themselves more money. And so we just sort of strip that awkwardness out of the formula and just put it in a year where there's nobody running for any seat and let it be unto itself. So that's a reason perhaps to choose that 2024 option.
As well, it says an even year, which many of us just weighed in a lot about. Mark Wallach?
Well, I have one more question.
Oh, you had another question.
Yeah, I've got one more.
You're up next, Mark.
And this is just a question about whether we have an identified funding source for any, we kind of just went through our projections for next year. We don't really have, seem to have enough to fund the things we're interested. So is this something that would just kind of, I guess if we were to make a decision about trying to put something on for this year, what does that mean in terms of budgeting?
So it is not identified. It would be funded through the general fund, and then it would largely be cost allocated to other dedicated funds, as do council costs now.
Thank you.
Is that it, Nicole? I was not trying to get past you quickly there. Sorry about that. Mark is up with the questions, and then if you want to put your hands up for comments, go ahead.
Is there, in light of the track record that we have in this community of having raises turned down, is there anything that prevents us from doing it in 2024, but doing the polling this year to see if it's even a viable concept to proceed on? I mean, it would seem to me, I'd like to know, are we like Fort Collins, or do we have a different electorate with a different set of preferences that would make this very problematic? So I guess I'm saying, is there any reason we couldn't poll to see the viability of the concept amongst the community?
Is that Aaron, Poe, maybe you or Cara, Nuria? Who can
Well,
answer?
I was just going to say, we are posing questions on whether you'd like us to poll on certain things. So certainly if that is something you'd like us to poll this year, we could do that. There's nothing that stops us from doing that.
Can I colloquy on that?
Absolutely.
So when we do polling, are we just polling likely voters for this year? Because we know there's a difference in turnout in even an odd year. So I'm not sure if polling this year would kind of help us think about what the landscape may look like next year.
To colloquy, is there a way to structure a poll so it's not just off odd year electorate and people? I don't know how
I guess I would just weigh in that that's something that we would ask of whomever we would hire as our polling experts, but that's something we could ask.
That's tough. Can I just add a little comment to Nicole's point about just sort of the electorate this year versus next year. The other thing to consider in this is there will be a new council, and so to what extent, not knowing what the makeup of that is or where that support lies for something like this, the question I have is, really, do we want to put a nice bow around a package before we get to next year, so that it's just sort of ready to go when we go to our retreat and we don't have to do any more work on it? It's just kind of like signed, sealed, delivered. We could throw it on the ballot. Or do we still want to leave some meat on the bone for us to work through during that council? So it's just kind of, where do you want to put the backstop and then work backwards from there based on completion? Because you can run this all the way through June of 2024 if we wanted to work for another year on this. But it's just more, that's a question for everybody to kind of answer. Where do we want to be sort of done and be ready?
I think, Mark Wallach, we are still on your questions if you had any more.
That's all I had. Thank you.
Exhausted you. Great. Okay. So in a minute, I will do a straw polls for 1, 2, or 3. Do we want to do it this year, next year? Not at all. But if you have food for thought discussion first, Lauren first. No?
I had one more question, if I can.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, real quick. When was the last year that a measure was put on the ballot to increase council pay?
Aaron, my recollection was 2015. I think there was a $10,000 increase. Effectively went from 10 to 20, and that was voted down. And I'm going to do this from memory. The lawyers could probably look it up, but I think it was 43% yes. It was 2015. I remember Macon Coles led that one.
Yes, it's been a little while, but that's all I wanted to establish. Okay, great.
Thanks for reminding us of that spanking, Aaron. Lauren, you're up.
I guess I thought Tara brought up a great point of sort of like there is a lot of different dimensions to equitability and being able to like financially make this work. I do have personal concerns of, I like that a lot of us do other work outside of council. I think that it makes that we have diverse backgrounds in that way, adds to the conversation that we have. And so one of the things that I would like to see is, as we do outreach and reach out and have conversations with the community connectors and all of that, that I do think it's important to look at more than just the pay itself and to think about, you know, how would that compare to having staff, you know, a higher level of staff support, and how would that cost compare to like paying council members more on the financial side? Like, I think there are a variety of different trade-offs that we could be making, including, as Tara mentioned, you know, how many committees and things that we are expected to sign up for, but just to make sure that this is a really well-rounded conversation around what the commitment level is, along with what the compensation would be. That's my thoughts.
Good thoughts. So I'll share just a couple things. I was, you know, I don't know how we compare to Fort Collins or others in terms of the volume of city councilors we have. So, you know, there are 9 of us, which is a lot, I feel like, for our size town. And so, you know, if it would just hit our budget, I think, a little harder to have as many of us being paid high. So just hope that we can get some more information on just the volume of people receiving pay increases and make sure that we're, you know, kind of daylighting that to the community. I also, I don't know if the mayor and pro tem in Fort Collins do the same job as the mayor and pro tem here. Having done pro tem, there's no way I would say that's a $10,000 a year additional job duty. I mean, and it's like you know, it's internally picked. So we would pick somebody to get that wage increase. And you know, under our charter, the mayor really doesn't have a different level of job expectation than city council members. We're all equal. We vote equally. You know, there is the attending Monday morning meetings. But, you know, I think, you know, my reading of the charter is that, you know, every 9th thing that comes into the mayor sort of, you know, should come to me as, like, you know, sort of be shared out equally to council members. So I don't think that should be a terribly disparate wage either. So I don't know how to capture that, but just in that was one of the ideas presented. I think that under the job duties of our charter, I would say everybody should get the same salary for Boulder. I don't know how that would be for other cities. So those are my 2 thoughts, Nicole, and then Tara, and then maybe we'll straw poll.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, just had a couple of things. So I brought this up as a potential work plan priority back in our first retreat in 2022. But even I, as somebody who really was eager for this, need a lot more information before I feel ready to try to put this on the ballot, especially getting information from people who can't afford to be in this position without a living wage. And I just don't know that this is really important. And I don't know that we could or should rush to get it done for this year. I would really love to see us explore this issue a little bit as, you know, we have time and staff have time. And, you know, maybe thinking about the idea of stipends just for people who can't afford to work 20 or 30 hours a week for $12,000 a year. You know, maybe we're looking at income thresholds or just some different ways that we could think about this. And I expect the people who can't afford to be here have a lot of really good ideas about how we could do that. I really, Rachel, agree with you completely. I don't love the idea of different income levels for different positions because we really are intended to be quite equal in our job duties. One of the things that when I brought this up in 2022, I was also really interested in the idea of boards and commissions and them being paid because they're almost completely unpaid, whereas we at least get a little bit. Many of them get nothing. And so, you know, I'm wondering too, as we're having this discussion, and maybe this is something that our boards and commissions committee could think about, are there, you know, ways that we could think about stipends for some board and commission members? Because that may be kind of a lower threshold way to start doing some of this, see how it works, see what kinds of folks could really benefit from this. So I think that would be an interesting thing to look at as well. And then I just want to third this idea, Tara, that you had about having a working group or something to think about how we can decrease the amount of time that's required for the work by making our work more efficient. For example, it's not clear to me that we need 1,600 page packets every week and some of the lengths of, you know, all this information. I expect that it may not just be council members who would appreciate that. We may get some kudos from staff too in that. So I would really love to think about that, because for me, that also relates to this idea of, you know, who can be here, how much time we're spending on this work, and how we can make it more accessible to others in our community. But Matt and Bob, thank you for looking into this, you know, initially, and thinking about it and kicking off this conversation. Really appreciate that.
Can I colloquy on Nicole's last comment, just because there's the former council members we met with their wealth of experience and knowledge. They also provided a list of what would be those process and good governance improvements. I didn't include that in the hotline because that really wasn't core to compensation, but that's a wealth of knowledge that we can lean on when we do want to embark on that conversation. So a couple things you mentioned, Nicole, were what former council members had actually flagged. So you know, those are well-known variables. So I just want to throw out there that they've already sort of provided a basis from which to catalyze that conversation.
More unpaid work from the former council members. They're gonna love it. Tara, and then Aaron, and then Mark.
Thanks, Lauren, for saying that you agreed with me and whoever else did. The thing that I want to bring up further, and then I'll leave it be, is when I ask a lot of people, why don't you run for city council? Sometimes they complain they don't like, you know, my answers on city council, and they say, well, why don't you run? But sometimes I really mean it. And most of the time for women, it is they don't have that time. They have their kids, they have their job, they have, you know, a lot of things that they're doing. So I feel like in our community engagement, asking, you know, I'm not saying men don't juggle as well, so forgive me for that, all the men who juggle, but maybe asking the person that like takes care of the kids. It's hard to get people with little kids on council, or, I mean, how in the world do they do it? Because of the time. So to me, I think time is important, just as important in some sense, because if you think about it, if we only do like 40, let's say we do half the AMI, you can't live in Boulder on half the AMI. So we still mostly have to keep our jobs. So I don't think it's an easy answer, but I think it's pretty complicated. But I think we have to add to the community engagement, you know, asking people why it is that they cannot conceive of themselves running for council. I mean, one might be because they get a lot of mean emails. Okay, that might be. But besides that, I think time has got to be a component for equity and for people specifically that work and have kids as well.
Thanks, Tara. Aaron and Mark?
Yeah, and agreed, Tara, that the time equity needs to be, I think, a piece of this conversation, you know, and that's an ongoing one that we can have about how to make this a more manageable role. But I do appreciate you all bringing this forward. I do think it's worth exploring. I mean, think about members of the community for whom, you know, they do have a job. They were not going to quit their job to run for council, but for whom it's a real stretch. And, you know, this could cover costs incidental to, you know, childcare, needing to, you know, get a little bit more restaurant food because you're busier, things like that. I think it can make it more doable for some members of our community. I do agree, though, that we need outreach to talk to people who might be in that situation to learn more and not just assume. So I'm going to go for that middle realm of starting to look into it, but not trying to go for it this year and doing some additional outreach. I think that's a good way to go. And then I'll just say the mayor doesn't necessarily need to get paid anymore. That's totally fine. It does take more time. I just wanted to put that out there. The number of additional emails and phone calls and meetings and things like that. My time commitment jumped up about 25-30% after I assumed that role. So it's substantial, but you know, it doesn't have to be paid. Just want to get that out there.
Thanks, Aaron. Mark? Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Aaron. Are you done? Okay, Mark?
Yeah, I think Nicole hit on it. We need more information. It's a complicated issue. The solution may be some combination of increased compensation, different work conditions, shorter hours, that sort of thing, and we ought to be looking at all of that. I think Rachel, I think Aaron is correct that the mayor's position is more demanding and probably warrants some differentiation in compensation. But if we do have that differentiation, I hope it will also apply to the mayor pro tem and be retroactive to 2023. But with that, I actually agree with Rachel in principle with respect to the mayor pro tem position, but I think the mayor does a lot more than we do.
Bob?
I just wanted to ask a kind of a jurisdictional question, because it sounds like there, and we'll do a straw poll, sounds like in a second, but it sounds like there's a consensus forming around doing some more work this year with the possibility of handing off that research to the next council, and they can consider whether to put this on the 2024 ballot. But I'm also hearing a lot of desire to not only do more work, as Nicole suggested, on talking to people about who may not have run for council, about how compensation may have affected them, but also a desire by council members to talk about workload and council efficiency. Matt and I took our job as the charter committee pretty seriously, in that a change in pay for council is a charter amendment that would have to go to the voters. How to reduce council time and make council more efficient seemed to be a little outside of the boundaries of charter committee. That's not to say that job couldn't be tasked to the charter committee, even though it's not really a charter change. But I just wanted to kind of tee that up, that we don't really have a place for kind of council efficiency or improvements in time within our current structure, unless you wanted to task the charter committee with that job as well.
Thanks for pointing that out.
Can I just let me just throw a qualifier if I can on that, Rachel, if you don't mind. One of the things that came through some of the former council members weighed in was the idea of bringing in an outside consultant to help us really look at our process, because we can't. It's hard for us to see the forest for the trees, really. And so just that was something that came from them, and their acknowledgement of when you're in it, it's hard to really wrap your head around what you are and aren't doing from an efficiency perspective. So throwing that out, that if we embark on that might be something that we want to consider to kind of do that full 360 review, and more or less in that capacity.
Nuri, did you have something to add to that?
Yes, and I think it's along those lines. I mean, I don't want to presume the straw poll, but I am hearing a desire to continue to work on it, perhaps not for this year's elections, but for the next. And I want to say that what I'm hearing too is this this notion of how does that dovetail a little bit with boards and commissions, and wanted to mention we do have a consultant that is looking at all of these things as well. That RFP response is due on the 17th of this month, so next week. And I think that there are similarities as we're thinking about compensation for a variety of efforts. And there might be an opportunity, if there is a nod to move forward, for us to develop this as a work plan item to look at some of those places where this topic intersects, because I do think that it certainly does. And then I just want to mention that staff too would love to have smaller packets and look at efficiencies on our end. So just throwing that out there.
Thank you for that. I'm going to double dip a little bit with my comments, and then we'll do the straw poll. So I agree with Tara, and wanted to point out that my recollection is that at the 2020 retreat, there was a commitment to shrink the packets. So I don't know what happened with that, but obviously they didn't shrink. So maybe somebody on staff could look back and see what we agreed to then, and maybe we could just implement that, and that would solve some of this. I don't think there's anybody who wants to do it this year, but just I think it's probably better in an even year, and I don't think there's a rush, because there's just no timely reason to do it fast. So I don't know why we'd vote for option one. And just in some of the feedback that we got in Matt's hotline, I think somebody said, like, we're not politicians, like we're not full-time political people. We have, and Lauren pointed it out too, I think, like, we do like having people with day jobs and not being, this isn't your life's work. So I think that would possibly change. And if we were full-time paid or paid, if the community saw us as, tripling our pay and maybe somehow being, I don't know, more, the expectations would go up, and I think they are already high. And somebody made that, a former council member made that point, and it's it's I don't know if the trade-off would even be worth it for a lot of people to have like the toxicity towards us get worse. So on the other hand, like I went and picked up some beer to have after this meeting, and I was thinking like, you know, this barely pays for the beer. Like the meeting barely pays for the beer I need after the meeting. it's a terrible wage that we get. So it should be raised. And okay, so let's do our straw poll. Who would like to move forward with this to get it on the 2023 ballot? If I see any hands. Does anybody just not want to touch it? Option 3. Anybody, is this dead to anyone? Show of hands for 2024. Consider, just do more research and possibly tee it up for 2024. I think that's everyone. Does anyone need more direction on what we're teeing up?
I don't think we do, unless Cara or Aaron.
I do, and it sort of goes back to Bob's question. Is the will of council to send the fair pay for council conversation back to the charter committee for us to then work with staff to move forward? And does this, so that's the first question. The second is, we're not including any of the sort of good governance and efficiencies in this. That's a separate thing to flag and lift up at a different time. I just want to be clear for Bob and I's efforts.
That's my understanding. Does anyone think otherwise? Does anybody want the charter committee to run with the, Tara, you do?
Only because I'm worried it's going to just kick the can down the road for a very long time. Yeah.
2020 to 2023. Okay, Lauren.
I don't want to, I just am worried that, by the time we work on this time crunch part of it, it'll be years. And I just don't want that to happen for other council members that come on.
I think colloquy on that, and then I'll come to you, Lauren. I think maybe Nicole mentioned boards and commissions might be a good committee to vest this conversation with, just as oversight. But Lauren, what's your question or thought?
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking if we're trying to do outreach to, people who don't feel like they're financially able to run for council now, I do think that having a more broad conversation about what that means is important to finding a solution that makes it actually work for people. So I guess I'm saying that I would like the outreach or the move, whatever goes forward, to include that conversation.
Nicole and then Bob.
Yeah, one of the things I'm just thinking about, because I mean, these do kind of tie together, right? Essentially what we're talking about is how do we make being on council a slightly easier lift for everybody who's here, as well as the people who are not yet here. And I'm wondering about, Tara, you're probably not going to like this because you just sent out a hotline, but what about, a working group or something that could kind of hold all of this together, because they are really interrelated, right? This idea of what we're paying, this idea of, how much work we're having to do, efficiencies. I mean, it's all kind of tied together in how we're making council more accessible to a broader swath of people in our community. So I'm floating that idea, even though Tara, I know you just we're just talking about how we have too many committees and things.
My problem is I keep saying I want to be on the next committee, but that's a whole nother story.
Bob?
Yeah, I agree with Lauren and Nicole. I think these are related, and it doesn't matter to me who you task this to. If you want to task the charter committee, both the question of compensation and the question of workload and efficiency, or if you want to create a working group or something like that, it doesn't matter to me who does it. But I do think that Lauren and Nicole are right. These are intertwined, and I would hate to have two different groups working on each side of the equation.
So I wonder if we could ask staff to come up with a direction and like a work plan, and bring it back, and maybe start with running it by charter committee, in that they're going to have at least a piece of it, and then bring it back to us. And then I see Matt's got his hand up now too.
We'd be happy to scope a work plan and work with the subcommittee to make sure that we have captured that, certainly.
Thanks, Marianne. My only question or concern is the fair pay stuff is pretty narrow laned. There's some outreach, but we kind of already, we kind of have the bull by the horns, more or less. the whole the efficiencies and good governance is a beast. And I'm only worried that once we open Pandora's box, it becomes such a significant work item that we're going to have to start taking other things off for staff to be able to really dive in. So I just want to just recognize that adding that could potentially really have some other impacts with regards to work, because it is, when you hear from former council members all the different tentacles, it becomes really large unto itself. So I just want to put that out there.
Nuria, when staff scopes it, is that you would bring that back to us and let us know if there's something that would have to drop off to make this happen?
Absolutely. And what I'll say is that if it is the will of council, we are happy to do that with council members Benjamin and Yates, just to make sure that we too are hearing sort of what they heard as part of that huge conversation. So if we have to scope it broader, narrow, or phase it, that we're making sure that we're bringing you a holistic sense of what that would take. And I think we're getting the sense of council's really interested in a variety of things. We'll also be able to sort of think about what that is looking at as we're also doing the boards and commissions work as well, because we certainly heard that too.
Thanks. Aaron, then Bob.
Yeah, Nuri, that sounds like a great approach. And of course, keeping in mind that we're looking towards 2024, when you say phasing, that may well be the way to handle it rather than taking other things off the work plan. We can just let it take a while. Thanks.
Bob?
I was just gonna make a process suggestion. I love what Nuria said. And we do have a placeholder on our June 22nd calendar to talk more about ballot measures. And so perhaps I'm going to suggest that if Nuria thinks that staff might be able to scope this a little bit, and we could squeeze in 1 or 2 charter committee meetings later in May and early June, we can at least come back to council on the 22nd of June, kind of have a little bit of a scoping discussion, and then council can have a conversation about whether both sides of this equation you want to task it to the charter committee, you want to have a working group. It doesn't really matter to me, but we could at least keep the momentum going and come back on June 22nd with at least some preliminary thoughts.
Nuria, does that work from staff side?
I think it certainly does. We can do that. I am not certain, and we'll talk to staff, that we actually have the ability to do the engagement enough for this year in the depth that you all have indicated that you would like, but certainly want to move forward, want to be able to scope that appropriately. And certainly there can be time in June to say whether or not that is correct or whether or not there's a difference of opinion. So
okay.
Happy to work with you on.
No engagement prior to June 22nd, but scoping and getting it turning around. Okay. A show of hands for all that are fine with that approach of staff scoping coming back June 22nd. Awesome. We're calling this one cooked. Who is this going back to? Aaron, Kara, Nuria?
I think it goes to Kara now. Thank you all.
Thanks, Aaron. And thanks, Bob and Matt, for all your work on that and guiding us through that presentation too.
Thank you. So the next item on the agenda is the staff recommendations with regard to the expiring 0.15 sales and use tax. Next slide. So as we frame this up, we just want to remind council, the current total sales and use tax rate for the city is 3.86%, and more than half of that is dedicated for other purposes specifically. So the general fund portion is just that 1.79%. So the expiring 0.15 is part of that 1.79%. Next slide. This, as we have said in the prior agenda item and this, it expires at the end of 2024. It was last approved by voters in November of 2003. So it was approved for a 20-year term. It was approved for general purposes, but we did want to highlight how that was described in the ballot measure to fund fire, police, human services, library services, arts and cultural programs, parks, and then the other general fund services that gave it that unrestricted use. It does generate we're expected to generate 7.25 million in 2024. The figure that Mark shared in the last presentation of 7.5 million is what would be anticipated in the first year that it would have expired, which is 2025. So next slide. And as we have, I think, shared, we feel quite strongly that this is critical general fund revenue source. It supports general activities. and that if it was not renewed or dedicated to a specific purpose, it would create a budget gap, potentially necessitating cuts to programs and the related staffing. We think it's really important to have this discussion 1 year ahead of expiration. It gives us opportunity to hear from voters and through polling. So we do have quite a bit of recommendation on the next slide with regard to polling. And we would recommend an item be placed on this year's ballot. That gives us another opportunity next year should we need it. So next slide. So with regard to polling, we would recommend to staff a long-term extension of an undedicated tax. Again, we would recommend a non-exclusive list of uses, but to include a list as was done in 2003. We would recommend that polling could possibly test a couple different iterations of lists of uses, and we would recommend consulting again with the polling expert with regard to that. We would recommend polling different lengths of time. We would recommend a minimum of 20 years, as that was the length of time that was approved last time, but potentially maybe 20, 30, or a permanent tax. And just want to highlight that Boulder County does have recent success with a permanent tax. So that could be an option. We also just, anytime a tax expires, want to raise the option of, is the amount that is expiring the amount that we want to ask to renew, or should we consider an additional amount? So just want to raise that up to council. We again would say undedicated, but with regard to the overall sales tax rate, we are currently pretty much at the top of the region. The rate is actually now above 9%. The total rate, because of the county's increase in their sales tax rate that was effective the 1st of this year. There are not many counties or regions on the Front Range that are above 9%. There are some mountain communities that have gone beyond 10%, but for the most part, we feel like 10% is sort of the perceived limit, and we're quite close to that already. We also have concerns with regard to sales tax, and it was mentioned in our earlier presentation. We think we are out of balance with regard to sales tax and other revenue sources, particularly property tax. So it's not something we would necessarily recommend, is to increase our sales tax rate. And there's equity considerations because it is a more aggressive tax. But just wanted to put that out there as an option. And then we also wanted to share another option, as you know, it has been recommended, beginning with the Blue Ribbon Commission, to try to rebalance our revenue sources, particularly between sales tax and property tax, that we could poll and hear voter sentiment with regard to the idea of converting the 0.15% sales tax to an equivalent property tax over time, maybe a small increment over a long period of time that would result in homeowners feeling a small impact each time it shifted. And we do think that would address some of that rebalancing and the equity and financial sustainability issues, but we also do recognize that this is sort of a challenging time to be potentially asking voters about that with the property tax assessments that were recently released and the uncertainty with regard to their property tax bills, but wanted to raise that as an option. And the next slide, I think, is our questions. And so they are, do you agree with the recommendation to explore a 2023 ballot measure? Do you have direction regarding polling, particularly with regard to the amount of the tax, the length of the term, the listed uses, and the potential transition over time to a property tax? And then lastly, of course, and or should staff start drafting any ordinances?
Thanks, Cara. Great presentation. My computer booted me a little bit through part of it. So if I disappear again, or if I'm really glitchy, somebody else should just take the reins, I guess. And everybody is a little bit, can you all hear me? Great, good. Okay, so any questions for staff first? I'm not seeing any. Oh, good. Lauren?
What would be the next tax that would expire, like that it funds our general fund?
I might ask Mark to jump on this. I don't believe we have a general fund expiring for, do you know that, Mark?
Yeah, I think that the next one is it's an expiring, well, it's a transportation dedicated tax that converts to general fund in 2029. That's the next one that has a voter action on it.
And so that voter action would be in 2029?
If we were to change it. So the voters have already acted for that portion of the transportation tax for it to convert to a general fund tax in 2029.
And I think we don't have another general purpose general fund tax expiring. I think the next expiration of a tax that I consider sort of general purpose is the CCRS tax, and that was approved for a 15-year term, so that would be off in the future, but that is for general purpose and capital.
Okay, thank you. That was it.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm going to leave my camera off because it is really glitchy over here. Any other questions? Okay, let's go through the staff questions. Oh, Bob.
I was going to go to the staff questions.
Great. Fire away.
Yes, Cara, all great questions, and I agree that we should poll. I think your polling questions are right, particularly the iteration one, iteration of uses, because as we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, we may have a competing ballot measure on that would dedicate this tax. It would take it away from a general fund and dedicate the tax. And so I think it'd be helpful for us to understand what the community thinks about various uses, including that particular use. Because obviously that use polls very highly, that could have some impact on the competition between our general fund ballot measure and the potential dedicated ballot measure, which we're going to talk about in a second. I do think it'd be helpful to talk to the voters or poll the voters on the difference between a sunsetting tax versus a permanent tax. I think that whoever sits on City Council in 2043 will thank us for that. Many of us will not be around by then. So let's maybe pull on that. As much as I would love to have a conversation with the community about shifting from sales tax to property tax for all the reasons you said, I'm not sure this is the right time to do that. I think people are owly, understandably, about property tax assessments and increases, and I'm afraid that a tax ballot measure that proposes to shift from sales tax to property tax is, as wise it may be for a whole bunch of reasons, including making our taxes less regressive, I think has a risk of failure. So we can poll on it if you want, but I probably wouldn't be in favor of shifting that now. I think Lauren asked the absolutely right question, which is, when's our next opportunity to do that? And it sounds like it's a long, long time from now. So that may be a conversation we have with the community separate from a tax renewal. So I think you're on the right track, and I support the polling that you suggest.
Thanks, Bob. Nicole?
Thanks. Let me just get the questions up. Yes, definitely agree with the recommendation to ask voters to renew and extend the tax. Regarding polling, I think you're on the right track. The only thing I'm just wondering about is this an opportunity for us just to get some information on a general strategy of moving away from a dedicated tax, or from dedicated taxes to more general taxes? And I think it may just, even though we're not necessarily starting those conversations as council right now, I think having some baseline data and trying to understand, where some of the obstacles may be in that would be a good thing for future councils to have. The other thing that I would like to see is I would like to see some polling data on the property converting to property tax, not necessarily because we're going to do that this year, but because I think there again, it's a useful baseline for thinking about where we're at, thinking about, what hesitations may be, because I definitely hear you all very much. And, we saw the impacts of being so heavily sales taxed during COVID. And I think it's important that we just start collecting information so we can move forward and help future councils make those tough decisions.
Thanks, Aaron. Then Lauren.
Yeah, I'll generally agree with what Bob and Nicole have just said. And I'll just highlight a couple of the points. One is that be very interested in the polling on the non-sunsetting tax, because I think that would be great to do if the voters are supportive of not sunsetting it. And then, you know, I think it wouldn't hurt to find out from the voters about switching to property taxes. I agree with Bob that I don't think that this is the year to do that. But I think we could actually, if we get this on the ballot and it is extended, I believe any other year we could put on a measure to trend to convert it to a property tax, right? That could be next year, the year after that. So getting a little bit of a sense of the voters' possible interest in that would be useful, even if we might not come back to it for a while. Thanks.
Thanks, Aaron. Lauren?
You stole my idea, Aaron. No, I'm just kidding. But that was going to be what I was going to say. Yeah, basically in line with what everyone else has said. And yeah, I think that in the long range, we should look at trying to transition to less sales tax. And thinking about, but I don't know if we need to pull on it now or not, but because again, I think that it would be in poor taste to do that right now, but in the future, we should definitely look at some ballot initiatives to try and transition some of our sales tax funding to property tax.
Thanks. Anyone else want to weigh in on the 3 questions that are being asked? I will say I generally agree with everything that's been said, and yeah, I think polling right now might be a little raw and produce you know, answers that might not be long-term accurate, because I think that there's a lot going on right now with property taxes, so I might hold off on that. Tara?
Not only did we have the assessed value of houses, but we also, don't forget, have that library, the library tax, or whatever we call it. So what? I'm sorry. What's the word, Matt? Give me the word. The library
district.
Thank you.
District.
Was not on purpose. I promise. Couldn't find my words. But I realize that sales tax is somewhat regressive, but also we do get our visitors to pay that. And so I don't know that it's that bad of an idea. I think people might be really overwhelmed for many years with property taxes. I just I do like the idea that we do get a lot of tourists and they come and they spend money, and so they help us by paying sales tax. So I don't think it's all bad. That's all I have to say. Sorry, Matt.
Thanks, Tara. Tara, did we answer that sufficiently? Do you need me to do any straw polls or anything else, or did you get what you need?
I think we got what we need. I think we're going to certainly ask long-term versus permanent. We'll talk with the consultant about their advice potentially with regard to the shift to the property tax. I think that's sort of in the maybe column, given the conversation, and definitely we'll test on the iteration of uses, and I think that's what I heard.
Sounds good to me. Everyone is now frozen other than Kara for me. So my internet's down. I'm going off of my phone, porting over to my computer. So hopefully we'll wrap this up quick and I can stay. But back over to you, Kara, for the next one.
Okay, thanks. And I'm actually going to shift it over to Alicia for this next session.
All right. And Alicia, thanks ahead of time. And then maybe if my computer dies, Matt, I think you were going to lead some of this discussion. So if I disappear, maybe you can take the reins.
Sure thing. I will see if I can live up to the mighty bar you've set.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to try not to leave, though.
All right. Well, thank you, Council. Alicia Johnson, serving the city as your city clerk and records manager. And my portion tonight is to bring you a brief update on our community-sponsored city petitions. Next slide, please, Emily. We have 2 petitions now circulating within the city for our voters to endorse or not endorse. The first one I want to bring to your attention, of course, is the Safe Zone for Kids. That petition is asking to amend the BRC Section 8-3-21, which is related to prohibiting items. This will be adding a chapter to that particular section of the BRC, and that would be subsection C as noted here on your slide. That petition was approved for circulation by me on March 21st. And I do want to just take a moment to appreciate my fellow coworkers and colleagues in the city attorney's office and also in the finance department that helped me maneuver through the petitions this year. So thank you for that, everyone. Both committees have elected to use both the online petitioning system and the paper petitions. And I'm sure you've heard we've had some glitches with the online petitioning system, but it seems to be working effectively right now. And both petitions will require 3,437 signatures to become valid and appear on the ballot and come before council. Next slide, please, Emily. The next petition that is out being circulated is related to the, as you've noticed, the existing 0.15% sales use tax. And this petition is seeking to renew that tax and extend it, and they want to earmark it for a specific purpose for arts, culture, and heritage. Now, that petition was just approved for circulation by me on May the 4th of this month, of course. And they, again, elected to use the online petitioning system and paper petitions, and they have the same exact amount of signatures required to be deemed valid. And I'm open for any questions that council may have in relation to those 2 petitions.
Thanks, Elisha. Who's got questions? Aaron, and then Bob.
Elisha, thanks for all your efforts in assisting community members with this, as well as all the other team members who worked on that. Really appreciate helping out with the direct democracy. Question for you is there a way for council and the community to monitor how the signature gathering is going for the initiatives?
No, that is strictly between the committee members. They have to prepare a inventory for us once they decide they're ready to turn in their petition packets. But no, we don't have a way of monitoring how their endorsements are going. We can look online with the BDDO, but that is, of course, the lower of the amounts because people had trouble logging on. And also the second petition came in kind of late, so.
Yeah, no worries. Just wanted to get that out there. Thanks, Elisha.
Of course, sir.
Over to Bob, then Nicole.
Thanks. My question kind of is a follow-on to Aaron's, Alicia. So I think both petitioners have, or petition groups have until June 9th to submit both their paper and electronic versions to you. Obviously, the electronic versions are already self-certifying, but the paper versions, you have what, 5 or 10 days after they submit in which to check those and verify those. Is that right?
That's 10 days, 10 calendar days.
10 calendar days, so that's the 19th of June. So do you think you might have I know you won't have a big presentation, but like a quick report to us when we come back and talk about ballot measures on the 22nd of June? I know that's kind of close there, but do you think you'll be able to at least give us an oral report?
Yes, sir. We have that planned because we are again scheduled for the 22nd of June. So we do have it planned to provide you with an update on the status of both petitions. I do want to note that the Safe Zones for Kids have already made their appointment for June 9th to turn their petitions in at 10 o'clock in the morning.
Great. Thanks, Alicia.
Of course, sir.
Thanks, Bob. And Elisha, Nicole?
Thank you, Elisha, for this update. This may not be a question for you, Elisha, and Nuria, just let me know if this is not the right question for right now. But we heard that there's a potential budget impact of that 0.15% dedicated tax measure of around $7.5 million. Is there an anticipated monetary impact of the safe zones measure? So, for example, would it require an increase, for example, to our $3.5 million safe and managed spaces budget or anything else?
So that's a good question, council member. And essentially what that measure does would attempt to codify what we're currently doing in practice. I believe that it will, as we continue and with the staff that we have, that we continue to prioritize certain areas, and we will do that. If at some point there is a policy direction to do even more of that, that is a budgetary request that we will take to you separately in a process, but nothing as I read the current measure would require that. It doesn't necessarily speak to adding resources, but it will also depend on what the circumstances are and how much as we're moving into the future. If we see an increase in a need to address certain situations in certain areas, then we as staff would come to you as a budgetary request.
Okay, or that we would just sort of have less budget for elsewhere.
That would be the impact unless we had a source of revenue for additional.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing all these frozen faces, I'm going to assume none. Maybe hands up when you would like to start answering the questions or contribute to discussion.
Do we have discussion on this, or was this just an update item?
I believe this was just an update item.
Oh, great.
Just an update. Yes, sir.
Perfect. Are you anything further on this then, on that update?
No, ma'am, I am done.
Okay, am I turning it back to you, Elisha, or someone else?
We are turning it back to Kara.
I'm up again.
Kara.
Okie doke. So the next is again an update. So no questions for this one. And this is just an update on the potential 2023 ballot measures for the state and the region. Next slide. So what we have heard from Boulder County is they are not yet decided. They may have a sales tax extension question. Their sales tax also is expiring at the end of 2024. So they may or may not put it on the ballot this fall. They will likely decide after some polling and when they have their behavioral health roadmap in place this summer is anticipated. And then we did hear from Boulder Valley School District that they do not have any current plans for a ballot item. Next slide. And as we have discussed earlier, at the state, currently there are 19 initiatives that have titles set and are out collecting signatures. 4 that limit property tax revenues, and those first 3 are all constitutional amendments, so those have more stringent signature requirements, and then if they are on the ballot, have that higher threshold of a 55% voter approval to pass. The 4th, that initiative number 42, is statutory change, and that one is the only one that isn't sort of tied to this idea of 3% revenue growth. The first 3 are sort of tied to that 3% revenue growth in some way. The 4th one relates to assessment rates. So we will see if any of those 4 collect sufficient signatures and are on the ballot. We will learn that after August 7th. And then the Colorado Secretary of State website has a lot of information with regard to that. And then also, as was discussed, Proposition HH will be on the ballot. This was the governor's proposal. It was approved late in the session. And just big picture, it reduces property tax assessment rates temporarily over a 10-year period. And then there would be some backfill for some schools and local governments, but as shared earlier, we would not expect that. And that's the update. Any questions?
Aaron.
Well, if I can, thanks. That was very helpful, Kara. I'll just add one more possible potential ballot measure that is out there, which is there's a group working on putting an early childhood childcare district measure on the ballot. So it'd be kind of like the library district, but for early childhood childcare. And they're looking at basically BVSD and St. Vrain Valley School District boundaries for that. So they're working with Boulder County on that. We got an update from them recently. So just FYI, there could conceivably be a handful of mills ballot measure in our area for that coming up.
Thanks. Any other questions, comments on this? Okay, we are, and I think my internet's restored, so it's nice to see you all moving again. So this, I think we're on to city council recommendations for possible ballot measures. Am I turning this to staff or Matt?
I believe this is Councilmember Benjamin. If we
So
move
formal.
the next slide. I'm always formal.
I'm gonna go with Matt. Matt, you're up.
I appreciate that, and appreciate the opportunity to continue to get feedback from council on this. As was sort of brought up in the mid-year retreat, one of the things that is clearly a need, and we've heard about this in multiple updates at study sessions, and we've heard this from Judge Cook, from Kurt Fernhaber, and we went to the county looking to address some of this in an expeditious manner to meet these critical needs. So nonetheless, a behavioral health, drug addiction, I mean, it can kind of take a bunch of different names, but really at the end of the day, it's to sort of meet those acute needs and amplify the services or provide services that we otherwise don't have or need to do in greater amount. So the concept was really around, does it make sense for us to come up with, I know Kara and Mark have given us quite a warning on dedicated taxes, but here we are. So I hope they don't give me the laser beams for bringing one up anyway. But nonetheless, is to look at products that perhaps contribute or exacerbate either mental health, behavior, or addiction, and specifically cannabis, alcohol, and tobacco, and looking at taxing those as a means of also funneling that revenue back into the very support services that would help individuals that suffer from those things. So that was the core concept here. And so we can kind of frame that in, does it make sense for us to consider that kind of revenue to meet some of that need? And in addressing that, staff put together a list of some of the ideas that would look like. There was a financial analysis of, well, okay, how much revenue do we bring in on these various different components, and what would various different taxing levels in terms of revenue generate? The example we sort of settled on is a 1% tax on these products, and that would generate roughly about $3 million a year at our current standard of sales. And so if we can go to the next slide. And so you see that right there in terms of a 1%. And then of course, you know, if you want to go less than that, then that's less than that. But that gives you a breakdown of the component of liquor versus tobacco versus recreational marijuana, and even medical, but it gives you a sense of where those breakdowns are associated in that capacity. So next slide. As Kurt and his team helped us identify, here are some of the ways in which we could use those generated funds to meet those needs that we have had ample discussion on. And I think we as a council are in our general alignment that those are needs and gaps that we would love to fill and provide greater services for. And you can see that list here in terms of continuing crisis response services currently funded with temporary funding, support for planned day shelter programming, increased support for community behavioral health partners or providers, and continuation of interventions piloted via ARPA, and supplementing countywide partnership initiatives. So all at different sort of funding levels, but all within the scope of what 3 million or something around there could potentially fund. And so what we'll kind of just leave this here for a minute. What I would also frame is a lot of the work that we are proposing here with the behavioral health tax, as has already been mentioned tonight, is something that the county is starting to pursue with their roadmap. And so it really kind of begs the question, and we've again had this conversation with our county commissioner colleagues, we don't know what that looks like. And so the question is, while we wait to figure that out, does it make sense for us to act on our acute and immediate needs? And if once they figure out what they are doing on some time frame, maybe that gets folded in, maybe they take over the work that we've started. I think that remains to be seen. And so really there's a fundamental question of, is one in the hand better than two in the bush? And I think that's a question for all of us to sort of answer on whether we choose to pursue this going forward. I will say that in the last week or so, there was sort of a potential added potential use of funds that I do want to throw out there. Pardon that I didn't get a hotline out. I talked to some of you guys prior to council because it sort of came in late by a few folks that didn't really have the time to talk about this in great length ahead of time. And that's really about thinking about how do we create more of those sort of recovery house model that can be a gateway to transitional and then permanent housing? I know we're bringing one and hopefully a second tribe into Boulder, and the county is doing some others, but maybe using this money to really funnel money into lifting more of those up so that we can really route people who otherwise are suffering from really acute behavioral and mental health and drug addiction, and instead of them either lingering on the streets and further suffering in that capacity, or worse off, ending up in jail, which is not the place we want them to go, can we create greater capacity to route them in a place that gets them off the streets and into dedicated, more full-time support services. So that's something that wasn't on the list, but I think something that's worth considering. And it certainly folds into some of the conversations that are being had with our DA, Michael Doherty, and some conversations with Judge Cook around, do we want to have some of this routed through sort of a pardon the word, but really some sort of like mental health courts and other added programming to Muni Court to kind of help divert people into this sort of programming and keep them off the streets and out of jail. So that's something to sort of think about. And anyway, just want to frame that. But tonight's questions really center kind of like they were with fair pay for council, which is kind of this red, yellow, green light aspect of, is a behavioral health tax something we want to, just stop dead in our tracks and say, yep, no more. We'll just rely on the city to meet, or the county to meet our needs. We're good there. Is it a yellow to say, hey, let's continue to cook this for a while and maybe consider this a down the road, or green light say, hey, look, let's maybe pick a couple tracks. Maybe let's have staff come back with two options that are two different uses or combinations of uses for a tax, and then come back to us in a little bit with that, and then we can decide which package we want to then lift on the ballot or something like that. So that's kind of the track. So if we can sort of maybe go to the questions, I certainly would then be, that's the end of my presentation, and then I can turn it back to Rachel to facilitate, and then I can certainly myself and staff that's around answer questions about this.
Great, thanks for that. Let's do it. Does anyone have questions for Matt or staff on this proposal? Come on, let's get one question. No? All right. Oh, thank you, Bob.
Probably a question for staff. I don't know if Kurt is on or somebody from Human Services, but I guess the question is programmatically, if this was to go forward, whether it's this year, next year, whether staff would be ready to put the money to good use and could frame up what the program would look like, who would benefit, what qualifications they would need to meet to be in these programs, and how many people we could benefit. Because I'm sure those are all kind of questions that voters would ask, whether it was on the ballot this year or next year. And I'm just wondering, kind of a level of effort question to staff about how quickly they could kind of be prepared to answer some of those questions.
Is Kurt in the house, in the virtual house?
Kurt was in the virtual house, but I'll say I do not know if he is able to answer. He was not feeling well this evening.
Feel better, Kurt. Can staff get back to you on that answer, Bob?
Yeah, we can circle back.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting the answer tonight. It was more of a rhetorical question about level of effort, and I imagine there'll be effort to determine the level of effort.
Interesting rhetorical question. Nicole and then Lauren.
Thanks, Rachel. So I was just wondering, can you explain more about the focus specifically on taxing alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana, and why these things were kind of chosen to explore?
It's a good question, Nicole. Largely because, these are known to exacerbate many of those existing behavioral mental health and drug addiction. And so thinking that the items that contribute or exacerbate those things that people are dealing with, taxing them and then routing that money back into supporting and helping people with those exact issues. And so it was sort of meant to be a very sort of circular and positive feedback loop with regards to investing that money right back in to meeting those communities that are dealing with those acute mental health and drug addiction.
And if I colloquy on that, Nicole, I don't know if you had another question too, but maybe it's because y'all know that I have beer in my fridge for after this meeting, and so tend towards alcohol myself. But I guess I wonder if alcohol and tobacco are really kind of in the same class as like high potency THC in terms of maybe triggering any of these issues, and like if it's drug addiction, I'm not sure I wonder, is there really the tether there from tobacco and alcohol and marijuana to the kind of like meth addiction is, I think, what we're probably trying to treat in fentanyl. So do we have to have a tether, and are all three of those really like the same for purposes of this discussion? I don't know if that's to Matt, or maybe that's a question for Kurt to answer later.
It's probably for answer, but I can just say, in terms of formulating this, it was really just a matter of what do we tax to generate a revenue to do anything meaningful. And as you saw in that financial slide, half of the revenue is generated by alcohol sales. So, you strip that out, then all of a sudden you've got to then dramatically amplify a tax on cannabis. Then the challenge is, do we then become non-competitive with regards to our cannabis taxing, where we're so sufficiently higher than our sister cities, we're driving business out of our community entirely. So I think there's a balancing act that we want to do to create some equity among those products, but also not be really disproportionate on one that then has a massive adverse response in terms of consumer or consumption of those products and the revenue that's generated accordingly.
Thanks. Nicole, did you have any other questions?
I just have comments left.
Okay, Lauren?
I'm not sure that this question is there's gonna be people who can answer it, but we're gonna go for it anyway. Matt mentioned sort of, that sometimes addiction, mental health, and can put people in situations where they are in our carceral system, going through our courts and things like that. And I was just wondering, in terms of costs that we might recoup, things that might not be spent, can we quantify, like, in terms of costs to the jail or to our court system, what Boulder pays in terms of tickets and incarceration related to mental health and addiction?
I mean, I think you're right that we don't know the answer to that, but if there is an ask to see what we could, we don't have control of all that information, but we can certainly take that back and see if we can provide a response.
Yeah, just if this moves forward, I think it might be an interesting piece to have as part of that future conversation. Thanks.
I had just one question, again, sort of pulling the three, different entities apart. Do we have any information on how the new state law is impacting local kind of mom and pop liquor stores? Because I think that we enabled the bigger box, grocery stores to serve or to sell more classes of alcohol, and I have heard that some of the independent shops have been hit hard by that. So I just want to understand, as to the alcohol portion of this, do we know what's happening with that class of industry locally?
This is Cara. We have not looked at that exactly, but we probably could do some of that analysis. I'd have to talk to the city attorney's office, sort of see if that's an appropriate use of our data to sort of do that analysis, sort of crossing. Is it outside the bounds of administration of the sales tax? So we can look at that.
Okay. Thanks. I'll save the rest of mine for comments and discussion. So maybe let's can we put the questions back up?
We can, and we put them in chat as well.
Oh, okay. Well, then y'all can look at chat, but let's just go through and share our thoughts and answer the questions as we go on this one. I know Nicole had some. I don't see a hand up yet.
I think I just put the hand up,
calling
right?
on you.
I think I just put it up, but I don't know. Maybe I missed it.
You're up. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. So I think with the direction about pulling for a potential behavioral health tax on specific products, I'm not particularly interested in that one. Just because more than alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana, it's poverty and trauma, especially during childhood, that are huge factors in vulnerability to mental illness and addiction. I think if we're going to be collecting more funds for behavioral health, I'd really like to focus on taxing those who are contributing to poverty in our community through low wages, through unaffordable housing. This was another one of the things that I brought up at our retreat last year that crashed and burned, was the idea of a head tax for large companies that aren't paying their workers here a living wage to offset some of the impacts of economic inequality in our community. So I would really like us to think a little bit more about how we can get to some of the things that are really leading more to behavioral health issues than substance use. And so I would say then no to the proposed ballot language. And I think, oh, sorry, and one more thing just related to kind of collecting another tax. I'd really like to see how our outcomes-based budgeting goes and kind of get that underway before we go after more taxes. I'd like to see if we can spend our money differently so that we're having more positive impacts on the priorities that we have, which our outcomes-based budgeting should start telling us within the next couple of years. I also kind of hesitate to think about doing a targeted tax. And Matt, you kind of mentioned this in your presentation too, when we've just said that we should be moving away from dedicated taxes and thinking about, balancing our revenue structure in a way that is more equal. Yeah, so that's basically where I'm at. And I don't have any other potential measures to raise for discussion.
Thanks, Nicole. Who'd like to go next? I mean, I can straw poll if we prefer. Tara.
Still having trouble finding that mute button. What does that say about me?
Ready for bed.
I am not against this idea, specifically if it can help pay for the day center, because I feel like we're going to have problems with our budget. We definitely, as somebody said, one of staff said, we have more needs than we do money. So I'm not against it. More so, the problem I think with the tribe, with the recovery centers, is we don't know how they're going to go. So we didn't even have one yet, and now we're going to have 3. I suggest we wait to see how that goes. Will it be successful? Will it not be successful? But we do know that we have needs for the day shelter. But I also do want to hear from Kurt and people from HHS about their opinion, so we can be in alignment with them as well. I think that I tend to be whatever the middle is. Is that orange? What color was that? Orange?
It's like a stoplight. Red, yellow, green.
Okay. Well, then yellow. Because we do need more information, and I feel like it's a good possibility, but we just need more info. As far as, we also don't want to take the incentive for the county to do something, certainly, because they hopefully should carry the lift, especially we're going to be having hopefully a tax, a dedicated tax, to see if we can use it for the very same things, as we know. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Tara. Aaron?
Yeah, well, I think this idea has promise, because the need for substance abuse and mental health treatment in our community is so deep and vast, and the resources that we currently have are so inadequate to the task. So I think that this has promise as an approach to make some progress on these deep problems in our community. So I would definitely pull on it and see what the response is that we get, and then we could go from there. I don't know if we draft ballot language right this second, but I guess I have a question for you. When we're talking about the polling, are we going to get the results of that back before our next touch point on this in June?
Is that to Matt? Cara?
I think that's to Cara.
So we have done an initial reach and plan based upon your direction tonight, plan to develop a scope of work that we will release on Monday and have a short turnaround on an RFP to get somebody in place. So we're trying to move as quickly as we can. So I don't think it will be tight for the June 22nd, I think, but there's potential.
Makes sense. What's doable is what's doable, but it'd be great if we're able to get that information back. So I would definitely take that next step anyway.
Okay, great.
Thanks. That's all I got.
Thanks, Aaron. Bob?
Like Aaron, it'd be great if you could pull, especially if that information could be back by the 22nd. But even if that's not possible, a different parallel path is, Nuri, I wonder if we could ask Kurt or his team to come back to us on the 22nd of June or thereabouts, to talk a little bit more about the uses of funds and how they would be spent and who they would serve, both the type of people, but also numbers. So I think those are all things that we would have to explain to the voters, whether this came on the ballot in 23 or 24. If we could have some polling, that's even better. But even without the polling, I'd love to know from the Human Services staff what this is. I also think that if we renew this discussion on the 22nd of June or sometime in mid to late June, we may have a better idea of where the county is on this, because I think we've all had conversations with each other about where the county role in this is, because I think these types of things that we're talking about for the uses of these funds are traditionally county public health responsibilities. And we did have a conversation with our county commissioner colleagues at dinner a few weeks ago, and I think they were still uncertain about whether they were going to renew their tax, and I would think that they would be kind of in the same box that we are, which is they have to kind of make a decision pretty quick here, because they have the same county deadlines for the ballot as we do. And so I would hope or think that by mid to late June, the county will have decided whether they're going to renew their tax for this purpose, and that could have a pretty big bearing on whether we want to go forward with a parallel tax this year or not. So I guess that's a request, I guess, to you, Nuria, is perhaps you could ask the appropriate staff to frame up what this could be used for, but also to continue to monitor the county tax and bring it back.
Absolutely. Thank you, council member. And I will, I don't want to commit to their capacity and availability, but I will certainly circle back and let council know and make sure that we can at least share something out on the 22nd. And we will be monitoring the county tax, sorry.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Nuria, or Ms. Rivera Vandermeide. And then Tara, and then Lauren, and then Matt.
I'm going to colloquy with myself right now because I forgot to say something, if that's even a phrase.
Indeed. You learned the word so well. Do it.
Okay. I want to agree with you, Rachel, and reiterate that I think we do need, I would love to really much want to check in with the local liquor stores and see if that did affect them. I think that would make a big difference. We don't want to ruin their lives, etc. in the same year that something else just happened. So I know I'm not making any sense tonight. I'm really tired. I'm sorry about that. I'm not even.
You agreed with me. It was perfectly logical.
Not finishing my sentences right now. Sorry.
You're good. Over to Lauren, then Matt.
I appreciated what Nicole brought up when Matt was talking about what leads to sort of the mental health and addiction things. My thoughts were like, well, for me, my job and cost of, staying in my house have really big impacts on my mental health. So I guess if we are going to poll on this, I would like to see also polling on potentially broader funding. Like, I am not particularly interested in seeing it as a sin tax, because I don't actually think that those things are as directly related. I mean, they are in some aspects, but they definitely aren't in other aspects. And I still, it's not that this is a huge issue, and I think that it is important that we do what we can to help in this area. I am really curious to see what the county's coming forward with. And my guess is that they also, you know, the incentives work out or make a little more sense for them, you know, being that they run they're running the jail and things like that play a bigger role in their budget, where, you know, most city offenses are not creating long jail stays and things like that. Like, there's just, I think that the alignment of getting some cost recovery from some of the things that might be implemented succeeding is probably makes more sense for the county. But that doesn't mean I'm not open to us doing something here, looking at it. I just am more hesitant on this than I would need to know more details about what exactly the programs are and information like that. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. Matt, then I'll call myself.
Thanks, Rachel. For one, I appreciate all the feedback that's already happened. Just two clarifiers. One, for Tara, with regards to Tribe, they already have a great track record. They have these lifted up in Denver, and they're seeing already really good results with a lot of folks. They tend to route, it seems, a lot of people that are coming out of jail directly into Tribe, and that seems to be a success pathway among others. So coming here isn't an experiment as much as it is an expansion of an existing model that's already shown to work.
Can I just real quick what I meant by that was an expert in homelessness recently wrote to me and said that she didn't feel like, even though Tribe was great, that it was for everybody. So whether or not we need 2, 3, or 4 is the big question, if that's where we want to put all our resources. So just to be clear on what I meant by that. So thanks for bringing that up.
I appreciate that clarity. So we'll leave that to the experts to decide what we need in that capacity. Is, I guess, the question is whether we unfurl the resources to make any of that happen. The other one was with regards to sort of this county-city tension. And the way I've kind of viewed this, and just historically looking at it, is when the county lifts up a program, it doesn't always meet every need we have. It may meet a lot, may meet some. There will absolutely be gaps in whatever the county lifts up to still our acute needs in the city. And so still at recognizing that and still trying to fill those gaps, I think this could be not duplicative rather than complementary to whatever the county also lifts up, allowing us to pivot. So I think there's opportunity there that we can still utilize.
Thanks, Matt. I'll say just a couple comments, and then Mark, I trust that you will bring us home on comments. I think that my couple concerns are one, I'm concerned about the mom and pop liquor stores and don't want, like, you know, extra fees there. I think that they're responsible for like half of the funds we would raise for this to drive people who are already going to the, you know, markets, to Costco or whatever, out of the city of Boulder and do further harm to them. So I would really want to know more about that aspect before we move forward with putting in another tax on them. I also, like, I think I'm more and more inclined for us, I keep talking about like filling the potholes, and, you know, if we don't fill our potholes, nobody else is going to come and do it. So like, I think that our funds have to be focused on what our lane is, and our, you know, I do think this is the county's lane, you know, mental health and addiction services and treatment. And so I'm worried, like, if we want to tax something additional, and I think we should make sure that we are using it in a way that we are in our lane and in one of the services that the city really needs to be providing, because we have a lot of potholes. Like, I'm especially on the bike paths, like there's a lot of potholes that are really dangerous to bike over. So I guess I just don't want us to like beef up our HHS, you know, and then create something that's going to have to be, you know, continually funded. It's not going to be a pilot. Like, if we tax this, it's going to be more staff and a bigger thing that we're doing, and probably the tax won't pay for all of it. So I would just be cautious about that. So I guess I'm probably in the yellow light area of, you know, I'm open to getting more information, but I don't want to, you know, be out of our lane and into the counties on some of the stuff, and want to make sure that we're not ballooning in a way that's unsustainable for the mission that we really do need to fulfill. Mark?
Thank you, Rachel. I agree with just about everything you just said. I have no objection to polling and getting more information, but I also want to get more information about the affected businesses, what it will mean to them, the impact on their livelihoods, and the prospect, as Rachel said, that we would be driving them, driving customers elsewhere because our products are not competitive. I don't think it's really a proposition that's ready for prime time in 2023. I think we need to do a lot more work on it, have more understanding, but I don't have a problem with exploring the concept. I mean, there's nothing objectionable to me about the concept if you can clarify that there's public appetite for it, that there's business appetite for it, and that we can do that consistent with the need to fill our potholes. That is, those things are not sexy, but they are such a core function of any government, it's always easy to be diverted by newer and shinier propositions and not pay attention to that. And that was at the heart of the community culture and safety tax to address infrastructure needs. And I don't think we should ever lose focus on that, because that really goes to the fundamental health of the city. But having said that, I'm in the yellow category. I don't think it's ready for 2023, but if we want to do a little more research on it and even expend the money to ask people what they think, I have no objection to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Nicole, and then I'll do a straw poll.
Well, we seem to be heading toward doing some polling. I just wanted to put in a request as we do that. Can we check in with public health as we're thinking about these polling questions? Because I really am concerned about giving people, kind of feeding that idea that it's alcohol and tobacco and marijuana that are the primary drivers of mental illness and addiction. And it would be wonderful to have public health, county public health, just kind of look and make sure that we're not going to be kind of feeding that narrative, because I think it's so important for our community to understand what the primary drivers of mental illness and addiction are. And that's not to say that these other things, don't matter. I don't want a polling question to kind of go against science and what that shows.
Thanks, Aaron.
If I can call on that, Nicole, it's a good point. I think I would hope that the poll would not be using explanatory language like you're just talking about, like, given that these are the main problems. Like, I don't think we want language like that in there, right? I think it should really be more on a factual basis of, would you support attacks of this kind to fund these programs? So I think that excellent fundamental point there.
Yeah. No, I mean, even with that, right? I would love to have somebody in public health just being like, yeah, this seems okay. Or can we think about doing this differently to make sure we're not pushing out information that's going to lead folks astray.
Fair enough. Let's definitely not misinform members of the public on a topic as big as addiction. Okay, so let's do some straw polls. I guess first, did anybody not want to go further with this? Is anybody at a red light? Nicole? Yeah, but I'll go red. I was yellow, but I'm probably red. Anybody at a green light wants it on the, oh, we got Lauren and over in the red column. Ladies for red. Anybody want to be a green and get it on this year's ballot? Okay, let's see the yellows. Tara, 1, 2, 3, we're yellow. Okay, so the majority is yellow. Mark's yellow too. Great, we got 5. Aaron, Tara, Bob, Mark, Matt. So in the yellow category, which means we're considering this for 2024 ballot, right? We're gonna poll maybe this year though, correct? Nods of, I think that's what we're talking about with the yellow. So are we comfortable sending this back to staff? And I think the charter committee kind of, are you doing this in your charter committee role, Matt?
No, not in any. No, it started there because we had a meeting and I brought this up, and then it kind of evolved out of that. I don't think it's necessarily appropriate in the charter committee. So Bob and I tried to extricate it out of the charter committee, so it's not in that function. So it lives in its own ether. So happy to hear guidance as to where it should reside.
Well, it makes sense that I would think that personally that you continue. So where else, those of you who have been closest to it, where would this be good to kick back to staff and some committee that Matt's on?
Well, as the other member of the charter committee, I'm happy to partner with Matt on this and work with staff. So rather than standing up a new committee, maybe Matt and I could, whether in our capacity, we're gonna have a couple of charter committee meetings between now and June 22nd anyway, so we might as well just take that on.
Okay, I think that would be, does anybody disagree with this also going to kind of charter and staff? Nuria, does that work from staff side?
I think so. I was just going to recommend before we went there and heard the recommendations that it could also go to FSC, since it is a kind of a budget question as well. But it would be great to get clarity on who would be reviewing that polling question. So if it is Matt and Bob, that's great. If it is another group, it would just be good to clarify.
Anybody object to charter? Since Bob so stoically agreed to take this on with Matt? Why would any of us object? Okay, great.
I'm on financial strategy, so I'm stuck with it either way.
Oh, bummer. Okay. Any questions from staff on direction on this yellow light project?
Cara, do you have sufficient information to talk to our pollster people and get some better clarity?
I think so. And then we'll also see if there's any analysis that we might be able to do to provide additional information with regard to the liquor stores. I have to consult with the experts on that.
Okay. Matt, since this feels like you have the most knowledge on this, any other questions that you want us to clarify?
No, I think I've heard what's necessary, and so is staff, and we'll take it back and continue to noodle this and see where it goes from there.
Awesome. Okay, I think we've got maybe one more thing to look at. So is this coming back to Cara, who's not, is that?
It's actually going to John, who had, there was a request to have an update on ranked choice voting.
Thanks for sticking with us, John.
Yeah, you're welcome. Good evening, City Council. John Morse here, Elections Administrator for the city. I'll be succinct tonight. I know we're getting late. So while much of what we've discussed tonight is uncertain, one thing we do know for certain is ranked choice voting is coming. And I just wanted to bring you all up to speed on how things are going behind the scenes in a nutshell. So since February, the city of Boulder has been meeting with Boulder County and then the city and county of Broomfield. We've been meeting regularly to kind of align on our strategies and our voter outreach and making sure that our messaging online is correct and coordinating events coming up and trying to divvy up the work as best as we can. In addition to them, we've also met with some subject matter experts in ranked choice voting, most notably the Center for Civic Design, Fair Vote, and Ranked Choice Voting for Colorado. And one of the biggest takeaways we got from the Center for Civic Design was this bite, snack, meal method of voter outreach. So basically how it works is we give small snippets of information as we're far away from the election, like a bite size. So this is kind of our websites are up, all 3 jurisdictions, and we should have similar language. And then we are starting to let our voters know that ranked choice voting is coming. A newsletter is going out in early June. And then there's the snack style, where we're giving them a little bit more information. This is mainly about how to fill out your ballot correctly. So one tool that I am especially excited about is we're developing an interactive tool of how to fill out a ranked choice voting ballot. This tool was developed by the city of San Francisco. I reached out to them and they were willing to share their code for that page and gave us permission to modify it to align with Colorado Secretary of State rules and also to be kind of Boulder-esque. And then lastly is the meal method of voter outreach. So this is where we're kind of giving everyone the whole shebang, and getting into the weeds on how tabulation works. So we're planning to put together animated ranked choice voting tabulation video. Our communications are working with us to plan that out, and we're hoping to have it out in July and August. One more thing to hit on, we have a list of community events we're planning to go to. Alicia and I are going to hash that out and then plan it accordingly with Boulder County and the city and county of Broomfield. But there are things like your farmers markets, festivals, and concerts. We're also looking at putting up a booth or a table in the libraries and rec centers. For some of these informal events, we definitely look to a few council members if they want to join us and be a part of our outreach. That would be fine as long as we maintain our meeting rules, but we'll be sure to let you know when those are coming up. I did see that we have Taco Festival on August 26th, so that's probably going to be high on the list to be at that night. And then, lastly, our communications team is kind of hitting all the waves on social media, and we're going to be kind of ramping that up as we get closer to the election time. So expect more frequent posts on your typical social media waves. And that's kind of where we're at in the gist. I'd be happy to open the floor to questions or anything of interest.
Thanks so much, John. Looks like Matt Benjamin's got a question for you.
John, first thank you and Alicia and the whole team for wrapping your heads around this and working so closely with Molly and our county clerk, and certainly and Jenna and Secretary of State's office. So really appreciate you working top and bottom on all those aspects to get where we need to be on this. As you know, this is kind of this is my baby, more or less. So I'm really excited to see us get to this point. The question I have is regarding sort of online tools in order for people, and I think you kind of mentioned this, but I'm just curious, but I want to sort of drill down. During the campaign for this, one of the real important things was we had a web tool that allowed people to do their own. We did mock, and people could just do it on their own. It wasn't just a city sponsored thing. People could just take this tool and website and have a house party and do it on their own, more or less, and kind of engage and that sort of thing. So I just want to just curious, do we have that kind of ubiquitous free access tool that people can just sort of sink their teeth in, and other groups can evangelize this without having to be totally, going through the city in order to do that?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, Matt. I think it's a website, RCV123. You can create your own ranked choice voting, whatever. Yeah, that's one thing we've thought about. I think for this tool that, again, shout out to San Francisco, is really great because it gives you notifications when you've done things correctly. If you don't fill out your ballot correctly, it'll pop up another notification of you didn't do this way kind of thing. And so it's very intuitive, and I'm excited. Our team's working hard on it to make it align with kind of our website flow. And then, we just kind of have to tweak the language a little bit to make sure it's correct. But does that kind of answer your question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I only loosely know of the San Francisco tool, so I'd love to see that. But as long as that's accessible for people, I think it's going to be really helpful, because I think there's a number of groups in the community and those around that want to help evangelize this and really be the sum of parts. So just having that access, I think, will be really helpful. I will say, to another question about council members joining and participating to help get the word out, I'll be the first to raise my hand to certainly join you all in that. And I think there's a number of folks that would like to join as well. I know from RCV for Colorado, Linda Templin and Emma Donahue and those folks, and certainly Open Boulder and some other folks would love to jump in on that. So just let us know how we can help get the word out and help support the work of your department.
Yep, of course.
Thanks, Matt. Any other questions, comments on this topic? Was there one more slide, or is that the end of our show here? That's it.
That is the end of our show.
Yep.
Well, awesome. Bob Yates predicted we'd be done at 8:40. So I really apologize for being more than an hour late. So you lost that one, Bob. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'm calling it done at 9:48 p.m. Have great weekends.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, everyone.